Yeah, we're off. Hi, guys.
Work out, and I think it was God's intervention, but
No, he's okay. Oh man, get the video going. There we go.
Owen.
What's up, peeps? I'm Jonathan.
I'm Nick.
And we are the GOSSLINGS.
Yes, sir. And we have something very exciting today. But first, it's going to get good. It's going to get real good.
It's going to get apocalyptic up in here.
It is. It is. All right. I'm going to go ahead and start us off
Hey,
with
goodbye.
our toast
Hi,
today,
Diane.
and then we will
G'day, Tricky. Good to see you back.
Our guest. Take up the broken sword of your father
and strike down the darkness.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Is
that bullet again?
No, actually, it's
no, it's a little smoother and lighter than bullet.
It's Gentleman Jack.
Really?
Yeah. No Michters or bullets today because inflation.
Oh yeah.
But
slumming it with some Gentleman Jack.
Yeah. That's right.
G'day, Phil. Good to see you, mate.
I didn't pay for it, so it's good. It's so yummy.
Well, do you want to introduce our guest?
Yeah, we have the Sultan of the esoteric, the king of Christian arcane mythology, the revealer of the dragon court, the master of the Genesis 6 conspiracy, author of the Genesis 6 conspiracy,
and the Illuminati's worst nightmare.
Baby.
Yep.
The man, the myth, the legend, the great Gary Wayne.
Hello, Gary.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me back. And I don't think I could ever live up to the introductions that you guys give for me. It's like
you learned them all already.
Yeah.
We are so glad to have you back. I think this is our 4th interview with you.
So yeah.
And every time we talk to you, we learn so much. I know that the people watch you just really enjoy it, and they learn just so much. And excited to jump back in with you. First, we have, like we talked about, we have a bunch of different questions.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and start. We wanted to kind of jump right into this and ask you about the roots of Freemasonry in the architecture of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And what could be possibly some of the ties to the pre-flood times. And that
Tricky, same here. We've got a really fully heavy overcast sky. It really poured down all night. The ground's soaking and there's no let up, so we're getting a lot of rain as well. As in the days of Noah, floods.
Original sacred knowledge.
Sort of a link, between, the Illuminati architecture that we know infests DC. Does any of that have any traces back to, in your mind or your estimation, to like pre-flood Nephilim architecture or technology?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And the answer, of course, is yes, it does. And it's actually rather profound. And, from a sort of a nerd sort of perspective, it's rather almost diabolical in terms of genius, in terms of what they've done in the city of Washington. And you could probably do a complete show just on all the occult things that were done in Washington. So I'll just sort of set the table for people that I know a lot of the audience will already know before we get into more stuff that they maybe don't know. So Washington wasn't a city before the Revolution, right? They actually built the city.
Oh, wow.
They chose the location, and I think they probably went through a number of locations that they would build this city, because this is going to be sort of the beacon on the hill. It's going to be the new city of light, the new Camelot, which is just absolutely filled with the imagery of Sodom and Gomorrah, which they would view as their cities on a hill, and cities of light and cities of the Nephilim. It would have to have significant for the location for what they were plotting as the Templar dream to create America, to be the launching pad for world government and universal religion, to be the place that they're going to be created, would have to have a significantly important location if you're going to put your center of that new empire that you're going to funnel your efforts into to create, and then create a sort of an organizational structure that at that time the sort of vision might be what world government might look at, is all these independent states with one central government and one central religion. The new Babylon, as the Templars were looking to institute. And so it would have significant astrological alignments, astronomical alignments, and in accordance to ley lines, not only as they sort of go about the earth, but as they intersect with other ley lines around the world, right? Would have to have all of that. And I think they might have had a few choices with that, but they also wanted a location that would be sort of central to the 13 colonies from the north and the south. Or maybe that was just a coincidence that it sort of worked out that way, but it also had to be far enough away from New York City, which was probably going to be occupied by the British, which they ended up doing. And they wanted to make sure that, you know, they're more decentralized in the revolution, I think, and then centralized in a place that would be a place that they might more easily protect. Although it was assaulted in 1812 as well, but not as easily, I don't think, as what New York was taken. So they would have put a lot of thought into it, and they chose this location.
Yeah.
And so that starts to make sense of what else they did there. So it's you know, when you have the ability to lay the streets out any way that you want, pick any location that you want, and then you see all the peculiar angles of the streets that are in Washington proper, the original city, then you start to say, well, why would that be? Were they that disorganized? No, these were the most learned people in America. They had the knowledge of the ancients, in terms of the secret society. So they built their angles to represent geometric shapes, and particularly triangles and pyramids, and as they would intersect in terms of pentagrams. And that's sort of the start of how they were going to run it. And then they picked certain locations where they were going to have the White House, the House of Congress, and everything else that would fit into that sacred geometry, that sacred astrological and astronomical alignments, and the ley lines. And then they built architecture that represented the pantheon of the gods that they were representing. So they used the White House and the dome ceilings, like the Pan temple at Mount Hermon. They bring in an Egyptian obelisk. They have, you know, in the dome, they have the apotheosis of George Washington, which is that ancient sort of representation of after the Rephaim die, they get raised to be demigods or gods, you know, that in heaven or looking down. And so all the thought process was there to honor their pantheon of gods and present in taciturn communication who they were and what they were planning to do to bring in the new Atlantis for the end time.
Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, well, and there's that fertility ritual thing going on with what is it, the reflecting pool and the obelisk and then the capital. The Egyptian, I think, what is it, the phallus of Osiris? Am I remembering that correctly?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it gives you sort of this reflection that is as on Earth, you know, so in heaven or on as heaven, so below, however that you want to do it.
Oh, yeah.
And then there would be a lot of rituals that would be associated in the occult, which there are, with the water and the pools and things like that. Yeah, and the water would also represent, you know, the gods of the sea, which play prevalently, particularly in the Atlantean mythos with Poseidon. Like there's just layer upon layer upon layer of things that people don't recognize whatsoever. It is absolutely astonishing what they've done in Washington to show the praise for the gods of who they worship and whom they base the 7 sacred sciences and the extra knowledge that develops that science on the gods, right? They were the knowledge cult. And so they're going to honor that pantheon of gods that's also represented in the wandering stars, right? So again, you create that pyramid that they have of the wandering stars in terms of and the wandering stars has not only antediluvian gods, but it has offspring gods that rise up afterwards as well. So you get not only in Washington, but in the education centers, as we've probably talked about in the past, you get architecture that is Roman, you get architecture that is Greek, you get architecture that is Egyptian, and you get architecture that is Babylonian, because they're paying homage to their beast empires that came before, which relates back to the concept that this is the platform for the end time empire that rises out of the ashes of the Roman Empire, which comes out of all the other empires. But the knowledge is antediluvian. The knowledge is the knowledge that built the pyramids, it built the great cities that we can't account for. It's the time of the development of those sciences and the illicit knowledge. And so all of it is to do like a renaissance of that. And so you had a parallel revolution that was kind of going on at Paris as well. That happened shortly after with the French Revolution. And they're going to do similar things and de-Christianize Paris right after for, you know, a short period of time. But they're setting up that cult of reason. And they have the exact same imagery that is going on in Washington as they do in Paris, France.
Tricky, and they're very supportive of my channel as well. So I like these guys. If they weren't on spot, I wouldn't be playing them.
That time. And this is just to bring back those ancient capitals that were, so it's like a reincarnation sort of thing, so to speak, of all of the ancient capitals of the great empires past that worship the same religion as they did.
Very interesting. How did they pick that particular spot on the map for Washington? Was there something special about those
the intersection of ley lines?
The intersection of ley lines.
Wow, great question. An intersection of ley lines. There you go.
And ancient First American or First Nations religious sites. So because typically you build upon the ancient sites. So one should look more into who, you know, was living there before in terms of the First Nations, and they probably chose areas, you know, that were sacred to the local tribes. I haven't done any research on that, but that would be my speculation because that's the MO.
Yeah, well, it is the MO because the Giza necropolis, like Graham Hancock talked about in Fingerprints of the Gods, you know, from a top-down, an aerial view, the Giza necropolis has not just the Sphinx with its water erosion, but also the pyramids, the 3 pyramids, which sort of mirror the belt of Orion.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is like a tried and true, you know.
Well, and another thing to check out, and I believe I did, I can't quite remember, but it might be also good to sort of check out what is the latitude of Washington City. If somebody Googles that, I bet you might find something correlating there as well.
Yeah, actually, I was as I was getting ready for the interview, and I was thinking about, well, I read there's like 2 really solid chapters in here about Freemasonry, and as I was doing some searches online, I discovered that before we had, right now we're like on the Greenwich Meridian basically determines where zero longitude is.
Oh yeah.
Right. That was established in the late 1800s. 200 years before that meridian, it was called the Paris meridian, and it's actually farther to the east.
Really?
Paris meridian. And what's interesting about that is that if you use the Paris meridian for zero,
yeah,
and you go 33 degrees north and 33
degrees, baby.
No,
Yeah.
33 degrees.
Which is the current 33rd degree latitude.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they basically reverse engineer it and flip it and say, okay, this is where we need to be in order to honor this.
Maybe.
thing.
Maybe. Yeah.
Dude,
that's crazy.
that is awesome.
That is crazy.
Yeah, we could talk for an hour on that.
Yeah.
Nick, you had another really good question that kind of, all of this ties together, but this sort of ties into it about cult of Saturn.
Yeah, the cult of Saturn too. Saturn is Saturn, Kronos, and he's named by other names throughout history as well. But it seems like Derek Gilbert wrote a book called The Second Coming of Saturn. I've been reading through that recently as well. And it seems like there's a lot in BC. There's a lot of imagery that would denote that a second return of this particular god is going to happen. And this particular god, I get confused because when I think Saturn, and I'm reading through your book and others, it seems like Saturn is this Luciferian figure, but at the same time, I get other inclinations that Saturn may have been one of the angels that sinned and has been locked away in the abyss. What are your thoughts on that? Who is Saturn? Is he Lucifer? Is he not Lucifer?
I think it's a really good question. So the first thought is a lot of people, like Anki would say that would be a representative of Satan on earth, except that Anki's not at the top of the pantheon, right? He kind of shares things. And so Satan would be sort of above. So when you look at Saturn, that is representative of a very important god in the seven wandering stars, and it's Kronos, as you were saying, and Saturn in Rome is the god for Kronos, also known as Jeb in Egypt, and Anu in Sumeria, which is the parent god of Anki. He's an offspring god, Anki is, and El in Canaan, and there's more because they all have these parent gods, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting, though, is that all of these gods also have sort of consorts or wives as well as parents, and as with the offspring. And in some accounts, you have, with the Leviathan sort of comparison, you have like Tiamat as being the female in Sumeria, which isn't a consort of Anu, but is Apsu. But in a lot of sort of allegorical sort of approaches, you kind of look at, well, there's two Leviathans, and is Satan kind of like that serpent-like Leviathan, and you have maybe the female that's killed in the beginning, and we know the male is going to be dealt with in the end time, according to the book of Isaiah. So a lot of people would maybe sort of connect that into Satan as well. But that's not the same gods as Saturn, right? It's a different one. So it gets a little bit sort of complex on that. And I think these are, when you have like Saturn as the sun god, which he's typically also represented as, and the chief god, whether or not it's before or after the flood. And what I mean by that is Zeus or Osiris would be like synonymous with being a sun god, and they're the offspring gods. And so the head god of the original pantheon before the flood with the parent gods would also be representative of a sun god. So I'm thinking that is an allegory for the chief god as well. And that's what Freemasonry believes, is all of those are allegories for Halel or Lucifer, the great architect of the universe. So I don't think that actually represents Satan directly, but they're operating on his behalf and below him, just as Satan would sit above the council of the gods. So who would be the chief sort of patriarch from a biblical perspective or an Enochian perspective? I would probably look to Saturn being maybe more equated with Azazel, which is one of the Satans. as being that sort of chief. But having said that, once we start to look at how the people worship these wandering stars, and by the way, they're essentially represented in the 7 days of the week as well in the solar year, as opposed to the lunar calendar, which would have been what the descendants of Seth were following and what the Israelites followed. And that you have this sun worshiping cult that's developed by Enoch, son of Cain, that is going to develop the 7 sciences. That includes the astronomy and the astrology, that's going to track the precession of the sun through the zodiac. You start to make a few more connections here, that what's being worshipped is these pantheon of gods, and Satan is sort of set above that. And I think that's reflected after the destruction of Babylon in the end time, at the midpoint of the last 7 years, where Satan and Antichrist are going to be worshipped, right? And it's a new religion that Daniel talks about in Daniel 11, that their forefathers didn't know. So I think you get a destruction of this old Babylon religion replaced with this Saturn Satan religion, if we can elevate it to that level, coming down and being honored in a way that he wasn't honored in the past, because it's the pantheon, both before and after the flood, that was being worshipped. They're the ones that were walking amongst humankind and mating with them. So we need to understand that sort of distinction. And so if we understand that, but it's still really part of the satanic religion, right? But it's just, there's 2 pieces to it, 2 layers to it. And the 3rd layer with the offspring gods, but it's the same structure. So the cult of Satan, as we understand, or the cult of Saturn as we understand it today, and I have no idea what other people researched on this, but it's a really sort of interesting topic, is an Indo-Aryan cult, which means antediluvian, right? It's the original Nephilim cult. It's that Enochian mysticism that was the black magic at Atlantis. It's the same sun-worshipping, astrological, polytheist religion. And it's sort of defined as the age of Saturn, and the cult of Saturn was the birth and the destruction of the golden age, which is antediluvian.
Oh, wow.
Right, and it's also described by the ancient authors as the time where, again, you have this golden age that's described in the book of Hesiod, and that's the one that they reference. So it's the age of the heroes, it's the age of the parent gods, and they're going to produce the offspring gods as well.
No, tricky, Diane. We got medicine for the dog. And Diane's got this little, Gabriel's got this thing that cuts the dog's pills in half, but it snaps them in half.
Sorry.
Yeah, look, sorry about that, Diane.
Sorry for the noise.
Well, whether or not they're just lower in the host of the rebellious army, or they're actually created, that's probably allegory, because I don't think they created gods. I think I think they created demigods. They may be able to create, a lower set of gods by taking a physical body and copulating with each other, but there seemingly was no need to do that, because they wouldn't have the same sort of capability as the parent gods. They'd be a product of the physical world, right? As opposed to being a product of the spiritual world. And so it would be hard to imagine how they could overthrow the parent gods.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't think they actually do. I think the parent gods go to the abyss for the crimes that they did against humanity, for crimes against creation, and which would include the creation of the Nephilim. And then I think the offspring gods did the same thing again, and they also went to the abyss, which is why they no longer walk amongst us after the flood. So this is the time of the reigning of Saturn, which is the god of time, as they like to call it in the antediluvian epoch. And this is very much a religion that is taken to heart by the Etruscans and then passed on to the Romans. And so when you get the creation of Rome, you get the 7 hills of Rome, right?
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? And those are the Palatine Hill, the Abertine Hill, the Caelian Hill, the Capuline Hill, the Esquiline Hill, the Quernal Hill, and the Verminal Hill. 7 hills, the 7 mountains, right, of Rome. Vatican Hill would be outside the original walls of Rome, but around 800 AD or so, or maybe a little bit before, it was set inside the walls of Rome. And it's a sister city to the sister hill to the Palatine Hill. But you had a temple to Saturn originally, and then a temple to Jupiter, his son, so the equivalent to Zeus in the Greek pantheon, at the Capuline Hill. And what's interesting about the Capuline Hill is that's the Latin word that you get capital or capital city from.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
That's where we get the word. Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. And so this is in the city of Rome, and it's also, the festival of Saturnia went from December 17th to the 23rd, followed by the birthday of Mithra, December 25, followed by Sol Invictus. So you get a whole sort of surrounding of that sort of ancient Zoroastrian or Indo-Aryan religion that is going to be homogenized into Christianity with Constantine, but that's a separate sort of whole. And so what's interesting about that is you have with the 7 hills of Rome, that seems to be what is being depicted for end time Babylon.
Yeah.
Right? It's because the 7 hills are 7 mountains or hills, and also 7 kings, not either or, they're both.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that. And the 7 kings are the 7 empires who had this mystical religion, and those are the beast empires, just as the end time beast empire will have Babylon, that religion who's going to sit on 7 mountains. And Babylon, as you take that back to Greek in the New Testament, where it's used in the book of Peter and in Revelation, not only does it mean, as you take that back to its Hebrew word, it's the source word for Babylon, so it represents, that as sort of the imagery of one of the beast empires, and its religion that it's really famous for, because that's the religion of Nimrod from Babel, which is the source word for Babylon. And so this is that original post-diluvian religion that is restarted after the flood. That was the original Enochian mysticism that is being sort of idolized in Washington City that we just talked about, right? And it would be the same way wherever that you go on it. And so Palatine Hill is the home of the Queen of Heaven. And as and they all have a Queen of Heaven, but in the Roman pantheon, it was the Queen of Heaven and Sibylline prophecies. And that Vatican Hill would be a branch of the Palatine Hill. So I would look for the current Roman Catholic religion that sort of melds into this universal religion, but I would expect its home center on the 7 mountains to be within the original walls of Rome, on either Palatine Hill or on Capuline Hill, and would be the center for Babylon of the end time. And so now you can take all the other pieces of information that you have about the cult of Saturn and just sort of say, okay, that sort of brings it together, and we can start to move it to a place where it starts to make some sense. And we understand that as Babylon, because that's the 7 wandering stars that the Bible tells us that they were worshiping.
So it all ties together. 7 wandering stars, 7 hills. Yeah.
You got it. Everything is representative of that. And we know it's not Jerusalem.
Right.
Because Antichrist will move his religious center to Jerusalem after the destruction of Babylon. And we know Babylon is a city.
Hey, Tracy, good to see you.
City, like, I think 9 times in the book of Revelation. and it's also a universal religion, and it's also a economic system, and it's also a geopolitical system that controls the 10 kings, which is why they hand their power over to Antichrist to destroy Babylon.
Yeah.
So I don't know what other people say about the cult of Saturn, but that's kind of my research in terms of how it interconnects.
Gosh, that's awesome.
It is awesome. Do you know with the cult of actually with Seven Hills of Rome, and Rome, projected to be the new Babylon. Going back to our conversation about Washington D.C. and how it's uniquely laid out, is there anything in its design that is attributed to or as a homage to Rome?
Not specifically that I can tell, but I would expect that they've layered it in, but not that I've detected that I can specifically take back to Rome. But when you have that dome temple, though, right?
Mhm.
That I talked about in reference to Pan, you also have that temple of Jupiter that was that dome temple. And that could be that homage that you're looking for.
Yeah, on the hill. What was it called? Capitoline Hill.
Capitoline, yeah. And also you have, and they might even be the same. I'd have to double check my history on it. But you had the Temple of the Pantheon as well, which was a huge dome. Temple as well.
And has that oculus in the middle of it, that opening, that hole.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, and our Capitol building, we call it Capitol Hill.
Oh yeah.
Capitol Hill.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Gotta
And
pay
it's
homage to the to the legacy of your beast empire,
king of the pagan gods.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
The more one understands prehistory and the words that were used and the things that were made, you can start to peel back the onion on everything that's done.
Yes.
In
Well,
terms
that's what
of the architecture.
Yes, and
Hey,
that's
guys,
what
good to
makes the
see ya.
Genesis 6 conspiracy so great. We've talked about this in the past, but your attention to prophecy is what led you to biblical prehistory and this 30-year magnus opus that is the Genesis 6 conspiracy is sort of, sometimes people will ask, well, it seems like, this kind of stuff, like Rob Skiba talked about this, is like, this stuff kind of seems like it's empty calorie theology or discussion. It's like, no, it's not, because as you so, consistently point out, if you want to understand where you're going, you have to understand the prehistory of the Bible. And so all of these things that seem odd, the architecture of DC, the end times, Babylonian Leviathan, the beast system, it all has precedent.
I'll go have a look, Tricky.
And the Genesis 6 conspiracy, and that's what makes it important.
Yeah, it's so important to understand what they're doing so you're not deceived, right?
Right.
And I get also asked a lot of times, do you believe what they say? And my standard answer is that it's not important whether I believe what they're saying or whether I believe it's all accurate what they're saying. What's important is that they believe it,
right,
and what they're doing with that belief and that information.
Right. Yeah, it's like the Illuminati in the music industry. You see a lot of breakdown videos, on YouTube, especially with the hip hop industry, But it's replete. It's everywhere, and it's that same thing. It's like, does it matter if it's real or not, or whether you believe it or not? Well, yes, but what really kind of matters is the fact that they believe it, and it's vital to them. Therefore, it's going to manifest in ways that, whether or not they are under a delusion or whether or not they're really in consort with in league with the devil, like that's how it manifests.
I have a quick question for you, Gary. In light of how Washington was designed, by Freemasons, with all of this attributed to these pagan gods and all of that connection to prehistory, do you ever cringe when someone says that America is a Christian nation founded on Christian principles?
As a Canadian,
what do you think when you hear that?
I mean, you guys did burn the White House down in 1812, so good for you. You made an attempt to save us from ourselves, Gary.
Yes. That was more the British though, but it was a war with Canada as well at the time. But so yeah, I do to a certain degree, and I don't with sort of disrespect to people who look at what the Constitution and the nation did. But we need to sort of look through the lens of what the founders were actually trying to do. They weren't necessarily trying to protect the rights and worship of Christians. They were looking to protect their right to worship as they chose without persecution from the Vatican or the Roman Church or anybody else or any king or president or governor that would come along, right? They wanted protection that they could practice their religion without Vatican oversight, which is why you had that stigma of the Vatican influence. You couldn't have a Catholic president for so many years. It was sort of that sort of biases that went into it. The Constitution, although it has benefited for most of its period of time Christians in terms of the ability to worship, was always, in my opinion, based on the motivation of the writers, was to only protect the polytheists, and it could protect Christians until they were ready to turn it against Christians in a way that would lead to, the genocides that are coming in the end time. And we've seen that swing away in the last 40 or 50 years, that what's written in the Bible is hate speech. What Christians believe is racist, hateful, and bigoted. And year by year, they're upgrading that to a level of isolating people and a belief system that they can eliminate them from the face of the earth at will, because they're just not worthy to be in this age that they're going to be building, which is that new age of Atlantis, right?
Yeah.
And that they're too mundane and they're not able to vibrate and evolve into God.
And we're regressive, and we'll never transcend. And the only way to be a Christian is through theosophy and Christ consciousness and all of these
we're going to
new age bastardizations of,
But if I look at
a mountain of brass,
if I look at if I look at the positive side of the Constitution in the U.S., is all the other constitutions around the world that followed afterwards are based on the American Constitution.
Yeah.
And so, the world sort of benefited on that, but it's not as strongly written or built like the American Constitution is, because as we learned in the last few years in Canada, is our Constitution doesn't give us rights. It only gives us privileges that they can take away anytime they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Constitution, only they pay lip service, and that's always the big fight between with a lot of my fellow really conservative or libertarian, sort of off the grid Christian friends. That's always the struggle. The internal struggle is on the surface, it seems like we're a Christian nation, but we're really founded off of, this Nephilim ideology, French Enlightenment, Age of Reason, Francis Bacon, New Atlantis kind of mentality and pursuit, and so it's man, are we a Christian nation, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all? And what does that mean? Or are we Leviathan? It's really tough, man. As a patriot, as a lover of the country, as a Southerner, as a Christian, it's a real fight that we have a lot of times internal.
Yeah, and I know, the phrase "in God we trust" has been sort of accepted, widely, that's referring to the God of the Bible, right?
Sure, but no.
But is it really? Because polytheism, they tend to pay homage to their genealogies back to a specific fallen angel.
Right.
Or you could take that back to the head of the pantheon that ruled Mount Hermon after the flood, that again, the royal families would take their genealogies back to the Rephaim and the particular their angel that produced them. But Baal was the head of the pantheon, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, and that's the coded language that they use. What does God mean? Is it that? Or if you listen to other conspiracy theorists, they'll say, well, it's the guns, oil, and drugs, the illicit commerce that goes on, and banana republics, and Marines enforcing that. Just there's so much there.
And then if you think about it in terms of that we're not, and again, I know this is kind of sacred ground for American patriotism, but in the Bible we're told not to swear oaths.
Right.
But yet there's
That's
an
a
oath
real
of
fight.
allegiance to this Constitution.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a good point.
I struggled with it when ultimately it didn't work out, and I think it was God's intervention. But I tried really hard for a few years to get into the Marines. I tried until I was too old, actually, and I remember thinking that at one point that I gotta swear an oath, and it seems like it's a good oath. That's the enticing nature of the Luciferian game that gets played. Is that it doesn't sound like it's a bad oath. I mean, it really is. And I know so many great men who, are veterans who swore the oath and really believe, but you're told not to swear an oath.
And if you swear an oath, and it doesn't matter what the sort of softening up of it is as well, but just because you swear an oath doesn't mean you should do anything illegal. But what God says is if you swear a oath, you're to uphold that oath.
Yeah.
Right? And you will be held accountable for that oath.
That actually played out really well in one of my favorite dorky movies of all time that I love, The Man in the Iron Mask. That was actually a sort of a character arc of D'Artagnan in that movie. And they actually have that argument because he's protecting the king, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who's this, brat, and because it's Leo. And
Well cast.
Yeah, well cast. And Gabriel Byrne plays D'Artagnan, and he's awesome in it. And he says, I swore an oath.
Right.
And one of the other musketeers tells him, well, when the king betrays his country, you're no longer beholden to your oath. And he says that very line of well, an oath is an oath simply because it cannot be betrayed or broken. And it's that dichotomy of
It's almost like a covenant. It's almost like a covenant.
Yeah.
And I also think there's a spirit, though. If you're sort of in spirit, in the right spirit, that you're swearing an oath to God, okay, that's good, right? That's who your intent is. But that's not how the spurious forces are going to use it against you. It would be the other way. But also understand that God will hold you accountable for that as well. So,
well, and it happens.
Fulfill it. Yeah.
In that movie, and that's actually why I mentioned that D'Artagnan ends up dying for his oath in that movie, and it's very sweet. It's very bittersweet and tragic, but. Yeah, it's almost as if God only wants you swearing an oath to him.
Yeah.
Maybe, and everything else is maybe not worth your soul.
And God can trump any oath that he chooses. And we know that he can. He doesn't always do it. It might be actually more rare, but I think biblically we do get an example of God canceling one of the oaths. And for me, it's because you understand what is going on in the secret societies and the mystical religion that you understand the Moses story a lot better, where you have Satan after Moses dies is there to claim the body.
And
well, what right does but what right does he have, and why is Michael there fighting him? Well, if you think about Moses' story, he is adopted into the royal family. And if you understand what we've talked about in the past, that you are raised as a royal bloodline into the mysteries right from childhood, you become an adept before you're an adult. And he would have been educated and raised up at Heliopolis and sworn those oaths to the pantheon, right? Before God reclaims him in terms of, I'm going to, now utilize you for my purposes, because that's why I put you there. And also enabled Moses to talk to the Egyptians when he comes back in their own language. And in a way, they understood, would be no misunderstandings what he was telling them, because he understood everything about their religion and their language and countered it with that, and then with the force of God and for good. But when he dies, Satan's there to claim his legal right to Moses. But in this case, God trumps that.
Yeah.
And sends Michael. So he can do it, but I wouldn't advise swearing those oaths that may get you into a situation where it's not going to be trumped.
You could even say that
Michael
God,
might not come to save you.
right. You could say that God trumped that. Yeah, the devil's legal right with Enoch as well, because he walked with God and was no more, and Elijah, who was taken up.
Yeah.
You know, all mankind is appointed to die.
It's funny how God's such a benevolent father. Our dad was a lot like this, how he would break his own rules out of charity and mercy and kindness and grace and, you know, and love. You know, he doesn't ever betray his own rules to the detriment of his children.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. That'll preach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
And
I
I do think
and I love it.
that's also one of the things that Jesus taught. It's not just the legal aspect of the law, it's the spirit of the law too, right? So
The spirit of the law, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that ties into your question about the plagues.
Oh, the plagues of Egypt. Yeah. Actually,
if you want.
That was one of Nick's questions, but it's a good one. You know, we were interested in the nature of the angel of the Lord, and whether or not the angel of the Lord is a manifestation of the Trinity, and specifically, I don't know if this ties in together or if these are two separate questions, Gary. So I apologize, but we were really interested in the part where, when it comes to the last plague of Egypt, God says that He's going to basically do it Himself, as opposed to sending somebody else. So, does He send the angel of the Lord? Is that a manifestation of Himself? And is there a reason why He sends Himself in that final plague?
yeah. Yeah, and it's Lord God, so you get both terms, Yahweh Elohim there, right? So
yeah. So there's no mistake who we're talking about.
Yeah, so it's very, very important. And the angel of the Lord is the one in the burning bush, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and also the angel of the Lord, he blesses Abraham.
Someone that appears to Abraham.
Yeah. Right, and I think he also blesses Jacob as well.
Oh, yeah.
And you have two terms with the angel of the Lord. You have that, and you have the angel of God, right? That's used in Exodus 14:19, that it is the angel of God that is going to stand in the cloud and separates Israel from the attacking Egyptians, and then that's going to be the angel that is going to lead Israel in the time of the Exodus as well. And so we get, and when I referred to the angel of the Lord blessing Abraham, I was kind of more or less referring to Melchizedek.
Oh, yeah.
Because in the book of Hebrews, he has no genealogy. He has no mother. He has no father. He has no beginning and no end.
The mystery of Melchizedek.
Yeah, so it is perfect that a pre-flesh word would manifest himself, just as he did when he went with two other angels to Abraham just before the Sodom event, right? So we know he does that. Would bless Abraham, because that's going to be the nation that is the nation of hope, that's going to produce the tribe of Judah, that's going to bring Jesus, as being the Word made flesh, into this world to do the first part of his commission as a resolution to the angelic rebellion. That's why Adamites have been created. We're the resolution, right? And so you have it proper that the Word would bless Abraham, just as I think he blesses Jacob. And so you have, with this angel of the Lord, then you have him, and it doesn't say angel of the Lord in the last plague, which is the death of the firstborn, right? It just says the Lord.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it doesn't say Lord God there. Or does it? I can't remember. I think it's just the Lord. But But anyways, he is going on the first Passover to do this plague of the firstborn. Just as Israel is talked about as the firstborn of God in an allegorical sense, of course he's not. That would be the word, as Proverbs talks about. And that this is the prophetic feast of his crucifixion for his mission that's going to be coming along. And it's extracting a price, I think, from the beast kingdoms. And this is the first beast kingdom because Israel is being raised into a nation in Egypt for the sacrifice of God's firstborn at Calvary. So I think there's all of that is going on. And he's the Lord of the Passover, right? He's the Lord of the first Passover. And that this is going to be commemorated as part of the Feast of Weeks, which is all prophetic. I mean, of all of the feasts that are in the Feast of the Lord, not just Passover and unleavened bread, but all of them, whether it's the Tabernacles or Day of Atonement, they're all prophetic, right? For what's going to take place. And that this is sort of the start of Israel's commission. Right? And so it starts to begin, and he protects his people with the blood of the Lamb, which he's going to become the Lamb of God at the crucifixion, right? So I think there's just layers and layers and layers of things in here that comes along, and why it's appropriate for Jesus to be the one, or the Word of God at that time, to be the one who's going to bring that punishment into place. And what's also very, very interesting is that you have in Revelation 12 the image of the woman who's, produces, has 12 stars, which is a representative of Israel. And then you have the birth of the Messiah. And then you have the red dragon empire. It's the same description as in Revelation 13 and Revelation 17 is waiting to devour the baby, because that's representative of the 7 beast empires, right? And it is trying to stop Israel from achieving their destiny. And it is trying to ensure the Word doesn't complete his mission to save humanity. And they're actually going to try and kill Jesus when he's, Herod within the Roman Empire of that time is going to want to try and kill Jesus before he's born, and then when he's a child, right? I mean, there's this ongoing thing that is there. And then Satan offers the civilizations of the world, which is, dominated by, at that time, Rome again, which is representative of the beast kingdoms. Like the layers and layers of the imagery is just amazing. And so I think that's why he was sent. It's just because it was appropriate to do that with everything that was going to happen, over the next 4,000 years or so.
I remember I freaked out everyone in a kung fu class I was taking one year when they got to talking about that moment, when Satan takes Jesus up, and shows him all the empires of the world, and I was like, I told him, like, guess what? That's because this is his world. Like, he's the prince of the powers of the air, and he's been given dominion over this world.
He couldn't offer what he didn't have authority over.
That's what. Yes, I was like, look, he can't offer he can't tempt you with what he doesn't have. And everybody in the kung fu class looked at me like I was a Satanist. It's like, no, you don't get it. Like,
and Jesus did not deny he had that authority.
Right. Yeah. Jesus.
And he didn't deny he was reigning over them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It just, So I realized that it was one of the first experiences where you're like, okay, maybe I can't go this deep with a lot of, like, maybe we should, maybe we should maybe step it first a little bit. So I do want to go deep, though. I want to ask something actually really kind of unusual, but it just kind of stuck in my brain. when Jacob wrestles with the angel at Peniel, there's a moment where the angel tells him, basically, the sun's coming up, release me, let go of me. And then he touches his hip, dislocates his hip, so he can, and not before you give me my blessing, and there's a struggle. What is the issue with the sun coming up? That kind of has that echo of vampirism, but I'm sure that's a good angel. So do you have any insight into that?
Well, I wonder whether or not that is the angel of the Lord, because it appears as a man, which
there's a physical
obviously,
confrontation,
and just as we talked about, and then he blesses, this angel is blessing Jacob afterwards, and not just a small blessing. And typically blessings come from the angel of the Lord and God, right? The word of God and God. That's where the blessings come from, not a normal sort of angel. They may carry the message of a blessing because that's their duty, but this expresses a level of authority that to me is higher than an angel. And so when we look at what the blessing actually is that he's going to change his name to Israel, which is interesting, which is reminiscent of Deuteronomy 32, the sons of God, right? The angels. And it's representative of the sort of the root meaning to Israel, which was not Israel was at that time, because they weren't. It's a compounded word that is, he's giving him the power of the God Most High, as that's going to translate, right? And so he is then spoken of in that sort of terms as the great one. He's going to be one of the great one and one of the great princes of the earth. He's going to have strength to lead this nation for what it was going to do, and it would be, a significant struggle. So he is blessed with additional power, whether it's just in spirit or in strength or whatever that blessing is. It's a significant blessing, and you're going to get the 12 tribes from Jacob, right? That's going to produce Judah. That's going to be, so it makes sense again that just might be Jesus, and or at least the word at that point in time. And what's interesting is that it's the name Peniel,
right? Yeah,
that is named afterwards. It doesn't say it's the name of the angel. You ask the name of the angel, and then we get the detail that he names that place, actually Peniel and Panuel. It's two different spellings that are there, two different Hebrew words, but they mean the same thing. It means either face of God or facing God. So he named the place after wrestling with this angel who has the ability to bless, and then he names that place afterwards. And I don't think he was able to provide the name because, and he probably didn't get it anyways, and even if he did, he wouldn't understand the name of the word of God because it was too much to understand. But he names the place Peniel, which means facing God. And I think this was facing the word from God, who was with them.
Flesh.
And at sunlight, again, it's kind of like prophetic of the resurrection, that Jesus is going to rise, in the sun, in the morning of the third day. And what happens on that third day?
Diane, they're up to the 5th booster in Australia.
And in this case, the day after the wrestle, is something new is happening and changing. And Jacob is starting out on his great commission at this point in time because he's just been blessed.
Yeah.
And who does he meet the next morning? Esau. And
the reconciliation.
The reconciliation, which puts to bed what he's going to be doing going forward, right? Everything sort of resolved from kind of a spiritual basis. So this is the great commission to go forward, and he makes peace with Esau, and from that point on, we get the sort of the story of the developing nation of Israel and how that's going to work through the Exodus that we just talked about. So I think when you look at that word, Peniel, that to me is the significant sort of thing. And I also look at this is that it is also testing his resolve in the wrestle, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And in that, to see, does this individual have what it's going to take, or do I have to start over again?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
dealing with humans here. We're very stiff-necked people, just as Israel became stiff-necked.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think there's that. And in this whole sort of process there's this courage that is sort of being injected, I think, into into Jacob. And a lot of people will take this whole encounter with Jacob and the angel as being sort of a sexual connotation with the touching of the private parts, and it's an occult take on the story.
Yeah, it's a mutation. Yeah.
It is, and he does seem to touch between the legs and in that hollow.
I thought it was
right?
a dislocation of the hip. I thought that was
that was what happened with touching into that hollow.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, and so it prevents Jacob from wrestling anymore,
and from running away.
But what we do know is that that's the word for sino. So it's a tendon that is kind of broken as you take that back to the Hebrew, and which is why there was this sort of tradition afterwards that the Israelites didn't eat that tendon because now it was considered something special that happened, that was touched. Jacob was touched by the word of God, not only wrestled, but physically touched, and in that particular spot. And that could also be looked at as a blessing to be able to reproduce in great numbers as well. My speculation, but there's a whole bunch of different things going on in there. But for Christians, be aware that the occultists will spin this into, just as they like to spin a lot of that type of thing into the patriarchs and bring them to being not who they were, or who we thought they were, is what they're trying to do, is weaken your faith.
Yeah. I noticed that when I was in ordination class, because I had the experience of being in an ordination class led by someone who was more Luciferian than anything. And there was always the take was always this progressive, modern, they call it progressive, but it's really, like you so frequently and eloquently point out, Gary, ancient. It's this ancient, Luciferian, either Gnosis or pre-flood Nephilim kind of ideology, this, that just seeks to dismantle everything and just erode your faith, that like, oh, Moses didn't really do all these things, Jacob really had this kind of experience instead.
Yeah.
And it's just constantly there to just chip away, to chip away and dismantle the numinous nature of, and
then draft them into polytheism. So just like they draft Moses, and they're going to draft Jacob in, because Jacob is very important to them in some of their imagery.
Yeah.
Particularly with Jacob's ladder that happens, a few chapters before in Genesis 28. Right. And so they adopt that whole imagery and the whole thing into their polytheist beliefs. So they're not trying to totally dismiss Jacob. Yeah. They want to change it. They want to, that word that they're using today. This is an ancient expression that's called reimagining.
Yes.
So when you hear the globalists talking about reimagining something, whether it's the police or whatever else, that's what they're doing.
And they're taking something that is designed by God, and bastardizing it, mutating it, malforming it, and
counterfeiting
it, and twisting it into their own nefarious image that is only meant to corrode and separate you from God.
Yeah. So Jacob is a very important figure to them.
Yeah.
He's not mentioned that much, but he is in certain aspects, but people don't realize the imagery that they take out of the Bible that they rely on for a lot of their belief.
Yeah, and there's, Jacob's story is such one of extremes, especially, with the deception in the beginning and how unmanly he is, and just he's a very contemptible character, so he's so easily co-optable, and Nick had actually a really interesting. You had something about the pineal gland and Jacob's ladder that you were kind of interested in asking about.
Well, we were talking about that over our fire pit.
Oh yeah, our Mother's Day fire pit.
Yeah, Mother's Day last weekend.
Where all the best conversations take place, by the way.
Yeah, well, the is that where we get the word pineal gland? Because that's the gland in our brain. Yeah, it's the one that's known for opening the third eye, or what gives us our dreams, or what might release when we die, and that could explain people's near-death experiences and so forth.
Yeah, I haven't checked the etymology on pineal. I'm not convinced that. Well, I shouldn't say that, but it may have a connection as an etymology back to Peniel or Peniel, right?
Yeah.
And a connection to Jacob. I suspect whether or not there's an etymology there or not, that's public. It is that connection. And here's how they connect it. And it's got, again, a lot to do with Jacob's ladder as well, because they combine this into a similar kind of story. So in the occult, before I sort of get to what I started with there, because I want to preface it, in the occult, and I talk about the pineal gland in my book a little bit, and this is atop of the spinal cord, or the vertebrates of the backbone, right? And there's 33 vertebrates that they like to talk about in the backbone, which again should ring bells.
Yeah.
On how it's being used. And on top of that is the small bud, or this node that they call the pineal gland. And in the occult, it is the kind of like the root to the third eye. It may be represented in the forehead, but this is the real contact that needs to be working to activate the third eye. And third eye is the doorway to the God of this world, right? Satan, right?
Yep.
And to enlightenment, to unlimited knowledge, and to promising godhood. And so they then imagine then that the ladder in the allegory is like this pineal cord, right? And at the top is where the Godhead is, right? And that you will actually be introduced to this enlightened being that when you're in contact with, just as if Jacob were to climb that ladder, or just as he met face to face with the angel that he wrestled with, you would meet this enlightened being.
Yeah.
Right. But they co-opt it to who that enlightened being is in the occult to generally Satan, or an equivalent to Satan, but they sometimes use different enlightened beings, which would be, the pantheon of gods. It picks sort of separate kind of ones. So I suspect there's a connection right back to that in an etymology, but I can't say I've actually checked that out. It may or may not be there, but I know the occult takes that and just loops it in, right? It just fits. So if they change something else, and then they change the name to this. So, I mean, who knows how they came about with that.
And if you just do enough DMT, then you too can see the machine elves and travel to, higher planes of existence and achieve Christ consciousness, and, all this, all this stuff that just, it's also wayward, it's just fruitless. It's like, man, you're just living under the delusion of a false light and the pursuit of something that's not really going to lead you into anything other than
Yeah.
just the jaws.
Yeah, but it's not a
off.
false experience, though. It's not a false experience because a
No.
lot of people who do DMT will
Well-
report seeing the same demonic type entities.
Right. We got turned on to this, and this is something that I would like to do a little more research and then come back to you with later on, Gary, because I think you might find it interesting. We found this guy who had aggregated all these stories of DMT experiences, and they
Hi,
all
Bobby. Good to see you,
shared
mate.
the similar veins of basically, long story short, demonic interactions on these higher planes, and then demonic competition. Like one demon would be here and give you this brilliant information coming as an angel of light, sort of, or I say demon, may have been a fallen angel, but definitely a satanic entity. And then another one would come in, and the first one would get afraid of the second one. And like probably, I think, 5 or 6 different stories all correlate these same things.
It's weird.
And it's weird because, in the Jacob's Ladder story, correct me if I'm wrong, Gary, but I don't think Jacob climbs the ladder. He just observes it correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's this dichotomy here between like just seeing the ladder and perhaps being humble enough to not try to ascend the ladder, and then the ego of the the sort of the sorcerer, the alchemist who wants to harness the power of the
Wants to ascend.
and wants to ascend.
Yeah. And so typically that ladder, I mean, it's very, very popular in some of the imagery in Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism.
Yes.
That you're to climb that ladder. Those are like the degrees of the knowledge of enlightenment, right? To get there to be an adept level. And that you will see them climbing that ladder in Masonic imagery, which is different than what is, again, it's counterfeited and it's corrupted to their form of belief. So yeah, it's interesting stuff, but it is all of this, all of this world that is run by Satan. So it's just all designed to lead people away from God. It's just as simple as that.
And to appease your ego. We talk about the Egyptians, we talk about the Masons, we talk about these ancient cultures. There's one question that Nick and I sort of touched on at our fireside chat, which is strangely enough where we came up with most of the questions for this awesome interview. But I kind of wanted to ask you just a really simple question. Throughout all of history, whether it's Egypt, Babylon, the Greeks, Romans, today, it's never gone away. It's never changed. Why does gold matter?
Yeah. So when we talk about gold, it resonates in so many different areas, right? But we have to always go back and put our shoes on in the ancient terms again. We need to get into their shoes.
Yeah.
And because you have to have an understanding of what was going on. And what was going on was we had gods interacting with humans, right? And they were physical.
Yeah.
Even though they're immortal, and their physical bodies in a corrupted world can be corrupted as well, right? Right. Which is some of the reasons why some people would put forward that they would have, saw human females as being beautiful and wanted them for their wives. That's part of interacting in the physical world from a physical body, we can carry in that they put their spirit into, which had DNA and the ability to pass on that DNA. So that's the first thing. But then you're subject in this world to that interaction, and how do they keep that body immortal, or do they shed it and get another one? Well, you get this ancient sort of tradition in ancientology about this elixir of immortality that will come down in different ways, and elixir of changing lead to gold. Right. So there's something in there. And there's also the understanding of gold in the occult is the idea of purity, the idea of wisdom, or the knowledge cult. And it's something that's essential to immortality. As being a god, you have to have unlimited knowledge and immortality. as a god. It's an imagery to them of light, which is an allegory for knowledge again, and truth and immortality. So there's a distinct understanding that gold is associated with being a god and immortality and knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So then when you get into the understanding of some of the mythologies that's in ancient history about things associated with gold, it starts to make some sense. So you have this golden fleece,
Yes.
right? This is a material, right? It's fleece. It's like fleece of sheep that's going to be making into gold. You also have golden apples, which is,
Yes. Discordia, the Order of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah, which is typically thought of as the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil in the tree in Eden. So it's that knowledge.
Macintosh's logo.
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
Mhm.
And the
Wow, what did you say?
apples, which is,
Yes. Discordia, the Order of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah, which is typically thought of as the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil in the tree in Eden. So it's that knowledge.
Macintosh's logo.
Yep.
You know?
Yep. And and so you have that immortality of this clothing. And then we find out that in most all ancient cultures that
First time
took
I
the
heard
time to
about it,
document it,
I never
and
knew
most
that
of them
going on.
did, is the gods wore clothes made of gold.
Oh, interesting. Really?
Yeah. And so I think this was giving them some sort of protection to that body in the physical world that they had.
Okay.
That's what I think. And it also has all of the allegorical imagery that goes with it. Now that starts to make some sense that their spurious offspring, the Nephilim kings and queens, would like to have clothing made out of gold. And they would have masks and things of gold. And why they, hoarded gold, because they may have looked at that as well as things like drinking blood and other things to preserve that immortality. And so I think all of that is kind of intermeshed, because there's a strong doctrine that not only is gold indestructible and all the other features, it is a piece of physical immortality, not spiritual immortality. That's something different, right?
Right.
But something of the physical world that represents immortality, and that the whole meaning of this is, and I would also think that you would have gold, which it is, as we're increasingly finding more, is going to be used more in technologies and things that
because it's such
produce energy and power, right? So again, representative of the gods. So all of that sort of comes down through the secret societies, through the alchemists and everything else, and the Rosicrucians, and it's all sort of interconnected. But it has, I think, several different layers to it.
Yeah, it is, and it's such this. It's just there's a through line of gold throughout all the ancient empires and all the civilizations, and it's a good conductor. But it's always the basis of, it's a good electrical conductor, but it's always the basis of any fiat currency, I guess up until we get to like the petrodollar age. But I remember even 10.
Well, so that was going to be my last point on it, was getting to the money of it now. Because why would you, have something that was used as currency? I guess because of its extreme value, but that's just not where it was. So they didn't use paper money back in the day. They used coins, which are orbs, circles, and they would put the image of their gods or their kings on there, who were depicted as gods, and an orb was what they understood as represented a god, and an image would generally be put within the orb of that god or that demigod. And so that money would represent to their subjects that that's who you're to worship.
Right. Yeah, there is that. Well, it's that whole "you cannot serve God and mammon," thing,
Yeah.
and so there is a correlation
related.
there,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's related between that and then these things that covet.
Yeah.
They say, BS talks, but money walks.
Yeah.
And like it all.
Wow.
There's the correlation between like what you're supposed to worship and the actual physical representation of these gods.
Now.
Yeah, it's idolatry on multiple levels. when it
Yeah.
comes to
Now.
money.
Yeah.
Now let's take that concept to one more level.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
Hit me with it.
Gold is very shining,
Yes.
right? And we talked about the imagery of light. So it would represent the sun and the sun god that we were talking about earlier, and an allegory for Satan. So you have this imagery that is representing a shining aspect, and just as angels are shining opalescent beings, particularly in their spirit, but also thought when they take a physical form, and just as their spiritual offspring, they shone from their eyes, and they were called the shining ones.
Mhm.
And gold is the shining coin that would be the most shiniest of the coins that would represent all of that imagery.
Does that tie into
Wow.
why in some of those ancient cultures they'd put coins on the eyes of the deceased?
Oh yeah,
That
that's
makes
a good
sense.
correlation.
Are you saying that the
Diane, I wonder if their portal's opening, or I wonder if it's got anything to do with CERN.
offspring of the fallen angels, the Nephilim, some of them were known as the Shining Ones because of that?
They were all
feature.
known as the shining ones, yeah,
They had eyes that
that glowed. They would light up a room.
I missed
So-
that. Wow.
Yeah, and you see that imagery, let's say in
Oh, you mentioned
Stargate
this
with
before.
the Goa'uld, and they speak their eyes shone.
Mhm.
And we also get the same imagery in the book
Actually, Diane, I remember you mentioned the purple street lights before.
of Enoch with the birth of Noah, that they thought when he was born, because he lit up the whole room and he had this white ruddy skin, that he was the offspring of the angels, right? But yes, they were called the shining ones.
Yeah, I
And
remember
it's-
now, Di.
That reminds me, like in a lot of Renaissance
I didn't see purple in the sky, but I remember you doing the purple street lights.
art,
Mhm.
religious art, when they depict demons, they're this, grotesque, bulbous eyes, wings, a lot of animal features, but in a lot of those, their eyes are
Big.
set to contrast. They're big and they're bright, like they
they're big and
contrast.
they contrast, and they wrap around usually as well. So Akhenaten is particularly represented that way.
There's also they touch on that a little bit in that movie, that M. Night Shyamalan movie, Unbreakable, when Samuel L. Jackson's character who's a comic book aficionado, who's explaining to Bruce Willis, that like the villains always have really big eyes, and he correlates it to a more anthropological thing as far as like predators. It's more of an animalistic, predatory nature. But I think there's an undercurrent, a correlation there between the two. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and you get sort of similar depictions with aliens and
right, the grays.
and then you get shining eyes and glowing eyes with Bigfoot. There's a
eye shine.
consistent stream with creatures that were created by fallen angels that have that characteristic of those shining eyes. But the eyes would light up a room.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and I did that for the Heavenly Realms novels, where like all the angels just had like fiery eyes. They had no pupils and no irises. Even the good angels and the bad angels. Is there any sort of biblical? It's been so long since I've looked it up, but is there any sort of biblical reference to angels whether they're good or bad, having any sort of luminous eyes?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
But when they take a physical presence, they have the ability to take whatever form they want.
Right. Yeah.
So they would have that ability to do that.
And to mesmerize with
I just
it.
wanna pick her up.
But that form would always have a shining sort of essence to it, because
You know, the cool thing about interviewing Gary is we ask him a question like, "Why does gold matter?" And then you give us like at least half a dozen amazing reasons.
Yeah, man.
Why gold matters, you know?
Yeah.
So I had another question that was kind of a pet of mine. You know, there's a lot of talk, and we're past the 45-minute mark, so we can like actually talk about this now. There's a lot of QAnon community about Jasara, and this it's going to be, you know, backed by gold, along with a lot of other things, property, you know, real estate, resources, stuff like that. And this is not a new thing. This whole Jasara Nisara reset, you know, Great Awakening, you know, Christ consciousness sort of thing has been around forever, but it's manifested in the last several years with the QAnon phenomenon. And I've always been a little suspicious of Q. I think a lot of what they say is right, but their solution is always very Luciferian. It's very human. It doesn't really involve the biblical Lord. So, and then there's this video out there where you can see General Flynn, who is he's second in command under Trump, and Trump is like the leader of the QAnon movement, right? And we like Trump in a lot of ways, but this is just part of this whole conspiracy theory thing. But there's a video where General Flynn is giving the same prayer that the prophetess
Hi,
or Saint
Ryan, welcome
Germain
back.
is giving. And everybody loves, you know, all the QAnon people, they love the Jasara Nisara thing. They love the gold reset. They don't really like to talk about the Saint Germain aspect of it, you know, and Saint Germain is such a strange character.
Mm-hmm.
There's all this, you know, revolving thing about, is he Lucifer reincarnated? Is it tied to this, you know, this currency revaluation and the French Enlightenment? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, there's
No, there's so much there. I'm sorry.
there is a lot there.
Yeah.
So let's just start with QAnon.
Sure.
That Q should be a red flag, and understand that globalists operate from a cattle herding tactic and strategies that they implement. So polar opposites, right? They're trying to cattle herd you into the middle in the open arms of the globalists. So we always have to be careful of ones that are saying, well, we're going to pick your side, because they like to divide it into two, but they're really doing the same thing. Just as you got a lot of people saying, well, there's good globalists and there's evil globalists. There's good Nephilim and there's evil Nephilim. It's the same agenda.
I think his new book's already out. I'm not sure, but I've seen a video of him last year saying it should be out by December, January. So it's now February, late February. So he's probably published it.
There's
He's
just
a
internal
good guy.
squabbles that are going
There are
on,
white
right?
witches and there are dark witches.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like bit magic,
Yeah, there's
black
Slytherin
magic.
and Hufflepuff.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's the same religion, it's the same pantheon, it's the same end goal. So what does Q stand for? And nobody really answers that.
Yeah.
And I do believe globalist and secret societies and polytheists, they put imagery in everything that they do. So Q, if you go back to the Hebrew word for Cain, it's Cayenne, and it starts with Q.
No kidding.
Yeah, and Kabbalah, mystical Judaism, isn't a K, it's a Q in Hebrew. As it's
No
translated in, yeah. So I wonder at that choice of Q, and I wonder whether or not they are just a different side of the coin of the end time world government agenda or not. So just be careful with them and watch more of what they say, what they do, and match things up and evaluate them. But don't get too hooked into it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But just be careful with it is all I'm saying. So, and then as you get into Saint Germain, I don't know whether or not they're associated with Saint Germain, but he's as you say, a very interesting character, and he may even be, in terms of his representation, older than what they say. Yeah. Because he typically comes around in about 15 or 1600 out of Transylvania, as I recall, which again would be, yeah, Transylvania, the bloodlines of the Tuatha De Danann, who were the Shining Ones, and Vlad the Impaler, Order Draconis, and the character that Dracula was based on, and that immortality of drinking the blood and things like that. He's also considered as a Rosicrucian, right?
Oh, that's right.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. And they believe that he was Bacon. Some people even say he was Samuel after Samuel's, but after Samuel might have been awakened or not. But
oh wow.
Anyways, so there's different sort of incarnations of Saint Germain. There are people in the 20th century who say that they met Saint Germain. That he may even still be alive, or maybe that's another reincarnation, as you had stated. And I certainly wouldn't call it that, and I'll tell you what I'll call it in a minute or two. But he seems to be like an immortal human, is kind of how he's being sort of represented, right? And that he is the one that in their belief system is going to bring about the age of Aquarius.
Yes.
The new age of Atlantis. And then again, another sort of thought process that he is connected to Bacon. They say he ascended to the Great White Masters in 1684. So that would mean then he would be sort of revisiting the earth and coming about again. So there's a tradition in polytheism that's called incarnation. So in the New Age, the Christ consciousness is an incarnation.
Yes.
Right? In polytheism, as in the Book of Narnia, people are going to get upset at me about this, but you have this.
Go for it. I got your back.
You have this lion god named Aslan, who is in another world, and Lewis describes him as if Jesus were to incarnate in another world. That's how he imagined. So he's reimagining him in that way in another world. Narashima is a lion demigod who had Shiva incarnated into him, whom Aslan is based upon.
No kidding.
Yeah. Buddha, and Shiva did many incarnations. Buddha received the incarnation of Vishnu and is thought about in Antichrist type terms as the new Buddha for the coming Antichrist. And so this term incarnation is something that fallen angels tend to do. And it's not like this possession aspect. It is more like a symbiotic relationship, as with Buddha, with Vishnu. Buddha receives additional power.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
And if you look at Satan, he actually does this at least once in the Bible, and maybe twice if you look at the Nakash. He may incarnate into the Nakash to deceive Eve, but he's not the one who loses his arms and the legs, but he may provide him the courage to do that. Just as Satan enters into Judas to give him the courage to betray Jesus. So he's providing something. The dragon will provide the power to Antichrist in the end time. So Antichrist receives his power. So there may be this angelic incarnation into an Antichrist type figure for the end time.
Yeah.
So there's a connection there. And then what we're told about bringing this back to Saint Germain, he is thought of as the Lord of civilization, and that he is the incarnation that's coming for the end time, to bring about the end time. So he's this ascended master, and he's incarnating. And I think what's going on is you're having either fallen angels or demons, because shamans and adepts will bring in a demon that will add some power as well. But then you still got two hosts that are fighting over, and it's usually the demonic host that wants to dominate. The angel doesn't need to be there. The demon does, because it can't interact in the world without being in a physical world. The angel has more powers to do things, and so that's more symbiotic. And so I still think it's a less symbiotic thing, and it's a demon-dominated situation with the adepts taking a demon in. But this seems to be like an incarnation doctrine for the Antichrist that's coming as a Christ consciousness in the end time and preparing people for that. And in their belief system, Jesus was like Buddha. Jesus was like Hermes. Jesus was like Cain. Jesus was like all the great prophets sent to humankind on the way to godhood. So the way of Cain, the way of Taoism, the way of the Tao, and the way of godhood as they're presenting it. And so Antichrist will be just like another one of these sent down in an incarnated format that will be the end time. And a lot of people believe that's going to be Saint Germain. I think not.
Really? Okay.
No, because Antichrist is going to be something a little bit more unique than just that.
Oh, yeah.
He's going to be more powerful. He's going to be something that absolutely mystifies the whole world. And he's going to say things and do things that are unheard of. And he's going to slander the celestial beings and God, and he's going to wage war in heaven along with Satan, and they're going to throw some of the starry hosts down. If we see, and this is an if, because I don't tend to buy into everything, but I know what their belief system is to a certain degree. I think if we're going to see something like that, it's going to be Saint Germain, as I say, something like a Saint Germain incarnating again. I would suggest false prophet.
Yeah.
Which will probably be another incarnation of some sort, right? That makes the way for the Antichrist, just as John the Baptist and Elijah make the way for God. So you need something that's very, very powerful that is going to counterfeit what Elijah will do in the end time.
Oh, yeah. Well, that makes sense because so much of the Saint Germain conspiracy revolves around the Saint Germain trust and the massive amount of wealth that is stored. In fact, there are a lot of correlations. Some people even suspect that Trump is, a manifestation of Saint Germain, or maybe perhaps at least his acolyte in the cult of Saint Germain. And to come along and do this great awakening and do the currency revaluation that everybody cares about, which is Sara and Nasara, which are a lot of Christians and a lot of, really well-intentioned patriotic people, but there's this greed aspect to it,
Let's take this up one more level now.
Go for it. Climb that ladder, baby.
So the age of Aquarius that's going to be promised at first is going to come through Babylon, right? That's not the religion of Antichrist.
Really? Okay. What is?
So what's interesting as well is, according to Alice Bailey, is that Saint Germain is coming back after 2025.
Oh, interesting. Really?
As she said, whether that's true or not, that's the time that they're predicting anyways. So I think this is going to come about after the rise of Babylon. That's when you would see an incarnation of Saint Germain if he's the false prophet. But it'll be something like that for the false prophet, because it's going to be different than the false prophets of Babylon that bring Babylon to power, because this is the false prophet that makes the way for Antichrist, as opposed to the plural false prophets that bring about the universal religion with their prophecies of doom. Right? If you don't unite under one world government and one universal religion, you're going to destroy yourself from the face of the earth. They're going to make these prophecies, and they're going to give you a certain amount of time, and if they don't do it, boom, this contrived catastrophe happens. But this is something a little bit different with Antichrist and false prophet. I would put it more into there, and it'll be look for something like that to bring about Antichrist during his rise to power, but not at the beginning, because Antichrist doesn't take power until the midpoint, after he takes credit for Armageddon, and he negotiates the 7-year covenant, but he's not Antichrist at this point. He will be, but he has to rise to power. So he has to defeat another Antichrist type figure. And Jesus says there will be many Antichrists, just as the epistles of John tells us. So he's going to need a war like the Gog War, the Joel 1 and 2 war, and the Revelation 9 war, and take credit for that, where thereafter, so this happens before the midpoint, but very close to the midpoint, after the opening of the abyss, just as Antichrist is the one who comes up out of the abyss as well. So there's a relationship to Azazel and or angels or something that comes up out of the abyss and is the one that is going to kill the 2 witnesses, and is somehow connected maybe through an avatar effect of somehow, some way, or just adding a power as the god of fortresses that he's going to honor. But this war happens towards the midpoint of the last 7 years, that Antichrist will take credit for, and then move his armies, as Luke, the book of Luke talks about, and the book of Daniel talks about, to surround Jerusalem with his armies and then set up the abomination. So he needs an Antichrist figure, and he needs an Armageddon type of war to fulfill his credentials, as well as a false resurrection that comes from that mortal wound with his head. And this is all going to be done in sync with the false prophet as well.
Yeah. Man, it's awesome. Yeah. Well, that kind of leads into what probably was Nick's most hotly anticipated question.
Oh, yeah.
Take it away.
All right.
Nick.
Yes. So Gog and Magog.
Yeah.
The traditional end times interpretation of that has been projecting that Russia is Gog and perhaps Moscow is Magog. I would like your take on that. Are we watching that unfold right now with the war in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine?
We're seeing the beginning of sorrows, and we're seeing the positioning of the 10 spheres of influences that the political, geopolitical globalists like to talk about, or groups of nations or empires that are going to form. So you're going to see 10 of these groups, just as the Club of Rome divided the world into 10. I think it's going to be a little bit different. So you see Putin wanting it's not that he doesn't want to be part of the New World Order. He wants a bigger role. So does Xi from the Xia dynasty bloodlines and the dragon creator gods. He wants to do the same thing. And Europeans want to keep all the other rival bloodlines sort of in place, right? And so again, you see this rivalry within their organizations, but they all want the same goal. But there can only be one family that's going to be Antichrist, and the nobility that would reign in their counterfeit millennium that they're promising. So there's going to be rivalries that take place. So it's interesting about the word Gog is God does not show up in the Table of Nations, but this is Gog of Magog. Magog shows up.
Interesting.
Yeah. Who Gog is in polytheism? He is one of the giant offspring of the parent god Iapetus. So you have a giant
I haven't heard that name. Iapetus.
Yeah, he's the one that Poseidon, as an offspring god, takes over for, because Iapetus is the god of the sea from the parent god aspect.
Oh, okay.
And so all the offspring gods, they kind of take the same mythology as what was given the parent gods. They all move up in rank, just as in the Saba, the army type of thing. So that's who who Iapetus is. And a lot of times the myths become, the legends become conflated because of that. And so Magog is also a son of Iapetus.
And Magog's the one mentioned in the Table of Nations.
Yeah. And the other one that's of interest is Albion.
Oh, yeah.
These are all the same, also giants that are mentioned in English mythology.
Yep.
Right? And Albion is part of the root word where the word Elbigens comes from. And Elbi being white, as in white bread, as in blanched, as whatever, and gens as in the genealogy to one particular patriarch. So when you hear terms like the Elbigens, that's a genealogy of the Tuatha De Danann, one of the one branch, and the Elven Magianic bloodline of the Cathars and the Elbigensians for their dragon Messiah. I know I'm looks like I'm going in different directions here, but I'm going to pull it back in. So what happens in the Bible a lot, and there's some examples in polytheism where you get patriarchs in the Bible who take their names after giants. And I think their names are changed to giant names afterwards as a denunciation as to what they did, which was go intermarry with the giants. Right? So I think that happens quite often. And you get, like, let's say, Nimrod is thought in some occultic accounts to be before the flood and after the flood. But Nimrod could be a name that was a giant before the flood, like say, as in the Lost King book of King Og has Nimrod as a giant before the flood. Gilgamesh, as another example, he is a post-Diluvian second incursion giant, son of Lugalbanda and a female mother goddess who's 2/3 god, 1/3 human. And then you get a Gilgamesh and Enoch book of giants who's there with Enoch the evil, who is trying to get the interpretation of this dream to see whether or not they can prevent the flood from actually coming about. Right?
Oh, really?
Interesting.
Yeah, so you have a giant before the flood that's Gilgamesh and Gilgamesh afterwards. So it's not uncommon, just as Hercules has an antediluvian name as well, because he's the son of Zeus, which is an offspring god of a giant after the flood. Okay, so that's why it's important to understand the flood and the offspring gods, in my opinion, in terms of how I understand things. So you have Gog as being this end time, as you take that back to Greek and Hebrew, as an allegory for an end time Antichrist figure.
Yeah.
Which is the same battle as I've talked about as Antichrist will take credit for, which is the Gog War, Joel 1 and 2. Joel 3 is the Armageddon War and the Revelation War of Revelation 9 with the 200 million people that everybody thinks is Armageddon and will at the time as well. And that happens as an extension of what comes up out of the abyss, right? So you see all that timing moving towards the midpoint of the last 7 years. So now Gog and Magog, so he's Gog of Magog and the chief prince or the chief Rosh of Meshech. And so you have Magog and that area in Scythia where they originally migrate to before you get a migration of Scythians and or Magagites or Muscovites, as you take that all sort of back to through etymology, through their genealogical history. They are going to migrate up into the Kiev region. These are Tartarians.
Yes,
These are the same, these are post-Diluvian Tartarians. And again, to understand Tartaria, you have to understand before and after the flood. And these are the same ones that are going to migrate into Russia and into Mongolia, right? And so Genghis Khan is described as white and as tall and as a horseman and is depicted like that. These are Tartarians. And they take their genealogies back to the 4 different types of Indo-Aryans after the flood. But where I'm going with all of this, and in terms of the Russian war, is that you have these bloodline families of giants, because that's who the Scythians are. They're the Tuatha De Danann, right? They not only migrate up the Danube into Norway, but into Germany and into Romania and into Ukraine and Russia, and then you also have the red-haired ones for the most part that are going into Ireland, England, and Scotland, right? Okay, now you have this Scythian, and they're called Tartarians, and Cossacks as the original bloodlines to the original czars that begin in Kiev. And one of those royal bloodlines that comes out of that is the bloodline of the original czars, which will be taken over down the road by the Romanovs, who are sort of a branch out of these original families. This is the family called the Putyanin.
No kidding.
Yes. Now, the name Putin comes out of nowhere in about the 1850s, depending on which researcher you're reading. You'll say it's his great-grandfather or his grandfather, but the name comes out of nowhere.
Yep, I've heard this before. He just
And his father moves to St. Petersburg just in and around World War I, or just before or just after, I can't quite recall. And so what happened in the tradition in Russia and in the Ukraine is, if the royal families had children outside of wedlock, they wouldn't give them the full name. They would give them part of the name. And that's thought to be the source of Putin from Putin.
And the name comes out of nowhere, just kind of like Gog just comes out of nowhere.
Yeah. And so also now overlay the double eagle imagery, and he's got two areas that he's going to draw on, that he's going to make as the emblem for Russia again, but I won't go into all the minutiae on this. I have a document on this if people want it, by the way. Just get a hold of me, I'll send it to you. And that what Putin is trying to do is set up his bloodline in what he believes is ancestral empire.
Real.
And that's a motivation behind what he's doing. He's not going to stop.
Interesting.
And so this is the, and so when you relate that, the chief prince of Meshach, that's the root word for Moscow.
Oh yeah.
And Moskva. And so when you start to connect all of that, is now you have the chief prince of Moscow, which is Putyanin, who believes he has royal bloodlines, trying to reestablish the original Kievan czars and that original empire of Tartaria for his empire.
So that's the real reason he wants it.
Yes.
He wants Kiev.
He wants Kiev.
Wow.
That's why he hasn't destroyed Kiev yet.
I'll get it.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to do that.
The Tartarian Empire.
Yeah. So he's going to be after the Baltic states and all of those borderlines. I may even include Finland. But that's what he wants to put back together. Whether or not he gets it all or not, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But you're going to see these 10 kings be bloodlines. And there are bloodlines all over the world that still exist.
Wow. Wow.
The Tartaria thing is, I think we wanted to talk about it a little bit last time, but I don't think we had time. It's interesting how, especially lately with Kiev and with Ukraine and with Russia, Tartaria has, I've noticed, really kind of circled back into the conversation a lot more for a lot of people online.
Yeah. And there's this huge connection to the Church of Constantinople with the Eastern Orthodox. He's going to need, as a Antichrist type figure, as in the God figure, he's going to need that kind of legitimacy that sort of goes with it. That also has the double eagle heraldic symbology. And I think that's going to be sort of in part that sort of continues to build his power and his control as he moves forward. Now, it may not be Putin. It might be an offspring of Putin or a relative of Putin, but he doesn't have much for relatives. So, but I think that's what's motivating him, because everything that happens in the macro level in the world is done at the bloodline level. And he has a significant tradition and sort of mythos about his Masonic connections at a very high level, which he wouldn't have without those bloodlines.
Right. That is such a cool take. I have heard so many different versions of why Putin is doing this. Everything from you know, he's destroying the biolabs, you know, and he's a white hat to, you know, he's a tyrant and a dictator, and he and Trump are going to take over the world and, you know, kill all the gays or whatever. I don't know, you know, but like to actually hear you talk about the ties to the bloodlines and the reestablishment of the Tartarian Empire, like, man, that's something no one else has said. That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, to really get into it, it's a full show. There's a lot of detail that goes with
it. Well, that's one of the great things about getting into the Genesis 6 conspiracy, about watching your interviews, about going to your website. It is a singular voice in a lot of ways. And so one of the things I wanted to make sure that we ask you about while we still have time is I wanted to find out about any sort of updates you might have about the sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy.
Well, I'm still having a lot of fun writing it.
Good.
I know the feeling.
Don't we all? Yeah.
It's longer than I thought it was going to be. So I'm on, I think by the time I get done this chapter, that's going to be a few chapters. So I think it's going to be about chapter 65. I'm hoping to get through that. I'm projecting another 10, maximum 15 chapters at this point in time. So it's taking a little bit longer, but I'm really taking the time to put detail in, and particularly detail on all of the sourcing footnotes. So it can always takes longer than what I anticipate. So I could make it shorter, but I just feel it just needs to be a little bit more complete. And so I'm still hoping to have it out this year, but it's not going to be out for the summer. I've missed that deadline and that printing, and the publisher's being quite patient, is basically saying, when you're ready, send us the sample chapters and away we go. So yeah, so I'm hoping for the fall, but and again, there's not that many more concepts I want to get in, and I know on the last end, but then it's a matter of just rereading it a couple thousand times and editing it and then sending it in. So
yeah. Well, I'm so grateful to hear that you have a publisher who is willing to be patient and supportive with you, because that is, not just in the writing world, also in the film world primarily, where there's so much money at stake in the budget. That is such a problem for creatives, is you are constrained a lot of times. So it's great to have a publisher who believes in you.
Yeah. And it's important as well, because this book is designed at Christians 100%, right? And, maybe there'll be other people who will read my other book and say, okay, we'll read this. I hope that, but they'll be maybe a little bit more ready for how deep it's going to go into the Bible. And so I want it so it's accurate, and not just accurate, but fully sort of explainable and supportable. Yeah. Because if you get some of that detail wrong, you lose all of your credibility, right? So
sure, the stakes are so high. Well, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy is a book that I love recommending to people, because whether you're a longtime, Christian like Nick and I, who are, just interested in a lot of this esoterica, and how it matters to the current, state of being, or there have been plenty of non-believers that I have recommended the book to. And it seems like the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, despite being such a compendium and such a, densely packed lexicon, I think even you have said in the past that, like, you can't read, multiple chapters at once or you'll blow a synapse, it's so dense with well-researched information, 100 pages of footnotes and bibliography. It's still something that you can sort of hand off to. It's sort of the gateway drug into the world. It seems like your follow-up is going to be something that's much deeper behind that.
And I can't wait.
Yeah, it is. And I want to be able to write it in a way that people can read it in the same sort of manner as the first book.
Good.
Because there will be that kind of information in it, but that they'll have, and I want to have we'll see whether or not the editor agrees with it, but I want the footnotes on the pages of the writing.
Yes.
So there's no flipping that goes on.
Right.
Because I dig deep, as I talk, I tend to a lot of times refer to the Hebrew word or the Greek word. I'm putting that information in the footnotes.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Those kinds of things. And so, you know, if I say for something like, you know, Gaza City is basically, you know, the Hebrew word Azza, and it also means the strong ones, and that was the city where the Avim lived, which were still there even after the time of Joshua. You get that information with the backup that sort of comes along with it, so that you know that these are a division of the Rephaim, and they're going to have to be dealt with later. So,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
awesome. Yeah, I
you-
found myself flipping back and forth quite a bit when I was reading through Genesis 6 conspiracy, just because there's just so much information. The sources that you cite is exhaustive. But the great thing about it, and I'm glad that you're going to be doing footnotes in the sequel. But the great thing about this is that, for example, when I was getting ready for this interview, I wanted to, read about Freemasons, what you wrote about Freemasonry. And you can go straight to that particular part of the chapter.
Yep.
And it's a wonderful encapsulation of just that topic, even though everything that's in this book is laid out loosely on a timeline that makes sense from the beginning. It does. It builds on itself.
But it's
you don't have to.
compartmentalized.
Yeah, you don't have to read the first half of the book to jump in to pick a chapter, a topic in the middle.
Oh, I
really
flipped
get in
in
and
and just
understand
started like reading about the Fairy Kingdom one day while I was like waiting for my tires to get rotated or something, you know. And it was fascinating, and I had no precedent for it at all. Like the book is so accessible. Actually, like, it's really
and that's because I tried to write each chapter as a mini story. And you know, starting at the beginning, if you went that way, it leads into so many chapters and keeps coming up as the book unfolds. So there's, if you wanted to go back and, you know, read it from the beginning again, and what I hear a lot and what I certainly found is boy, that sure made sense, a lot more sense of what I read at the end of the book, the last go around. Right. Yeah. But you can read it any way that you want and as much as you want, and come back to it when you want, and it's there kind of for a reference book as well. So
that's awesome. Great resource. So where can people find this book, the first one before the sequel's out? Where can people find Genesis 6 Conspiracy?
Best way to get hold of the book is from my website, which is the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the number 6conspiracy.com. And on the website, there's a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters so that you can get a good feel for you whether or not it's the right book for you or not. I think just looking at the table of contents will get your curiosity up. And if you did want to buy the book, you can go to contact or buy now and buy from the author and get a signed copy. Or from that same page, you can link over to Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, BarnesandNoble.com, or to the Kindle version and get the digital version. So best and easiest way to get it. It's also available on most online bookstores. And if you wanted to support your local bookstore, which I'm a fan of as well for sure, is that my book is distributed by, for my publisher through a company called Bookmasters out of Pennsylvania, and they supply the bookstores. Okay. So they could order it in for you if you wanted to order it from your local bookstore. So lots of ways to get a hold of the book, and every way is fine by me. It's about getting information out. But if you did want a signed copy, that's available as well.
Yeah, that's actually how we initially got this rolling.
Yeah.
It's like we got a couple signed copies.
I have a signed copy. Yeah. It's this one. It's this.
Well, Tricky, he did, didn't he? He died and got brought back by Batman. Wow, good pickup. And I didn't even notice that.
As you can see.
So proud of it.
There, right there.
It's adorable.
I am. I love it. I love it.
So, and that is one of the things that's so great about you, Gary, is that you are so generous with your information and your time.
Yeah.
You're not Smog sitting on the mountain of gold in the cave, daring anyone to trespass your fiery breath. People can. You've mentioned it earlier in the live stream. You can email Gary, and then you will send them whatever information it is. Papers, pamphlets, PDFs, I assume.
Yeah, I generally do it in PDFs, and I don't have one like on Saint Germain and some of these more fringe topics, although I guess I do have a lot of fringe topics as well. But like for Putin, for example, I do have a document on that. I do have a document on Xi and his bloodlines.
Cool.
And so if I have a document on that subject, I will send it to you, and you can, again, contact me through the website, through contact the author icon, and that email will go to me, or through Messenger would be the other way, or put a question or a request on my timeline on Facebook. So I spend a lot of time sending out documents to people on things, because they're looking for some information on it. So
cool. It's very magnanimous of you. So you have it you have the Genesis 6 conspiracy in paperback. You have it in ebook. Do you have an audiobook version yet?
No, and it's probably not going to happen.
Really?
Because it's a difficult project, and it's high cost for the amount. Audiobooks aren't a big part of the market. That's not the reason. I would love to have the audiobook, but it's the intersection of cost and expected return that most people will walk away from it. Now, there's been several that have tried.
Yeah.
And,
really?
Yeah, and they just
can't make it through. Huh?
Can't make it done. There was one group that started a year and maybe almost 2 years ago now, but last summer they told me they had it done. And
really?
then and they had gone through so much spiritual attack all the way through that they almost stopped many times. And again, I've heard that with other people, because I basically tell people, create a audio, if you like, with all my blessings. I don't even ask the publisher anymore. Just if I can find somebody to do it, I would do it. And they got it done. And they've said, it's done. We're just going to take, a month or so off, and we've been working on it. There's several of them working on it. And then, sort of went quiet, and they got a hold of me last October or so, and they said, we can't believe it. It's gone. Like, it's just been wiped from our computer.
No
way. Yeah. So I kid you not.
Which is borderline impossible, by the way. As someone who's had hard drives die.
Yeah.
Files. I mean, there are almost always ghost files.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything. Wow. No kidding.
Well, yeah, look, they were just heartbroken after so much time that was.
No, I can't imagine.
I bet they would.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, but for what it's worth, not that this is any great comfort for the thorn in your side, that the wound. A thief doesn't rob an empty house.
Yes.
So the devil only goes after you if you're worth something.
That's true. Yeah.
So,
good point.
I've thought about doing the audio myself, but it's the time and the commitment.
Sure, it is. Yeah. Well, and you have so much. I thought about that too with my first novel, but then you realize what all you're going to have to put into it. Are you good at mixing, EQ? Do you have the right setup for it? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And as the author, as the writer, your energy and time is best spent moving forward, and hopefully finding somebody who, got a good narrator for you. I'm just saying, Adam Burrows will send him your way. The line of very sentence.
I would just love to have it out there and available for people. So
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Well, let's see. We had two other questions. I don't know if we have time to get to them. We are over the 2-hour mark.
Can we ask you one more? Let's ask him about Rob.
Oh yeah, you want to ask about Rob?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Maybe.
So would you mind indulging us for one more question?
One last question. Would that be okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So we've been fans of Rob Skiba. Rob Skiba, unfortunately, has passed on, which is a tremendous loss to us. You had some interactions with Rob Skiba. I've always been really interested in his, because he sort of trades in the same, or traded in the same arena as you, which is the Nephilim, the pre-flood world. He painted a very fantastical vision of that, especially with the Tower of Babel in post-flood, history. he kind of waffled back and forth. He went back and forth. He changed, things up a little bit. At first, he thought it was maybe a Stargate. Then, when he got into Flat Earth, he thought it was maybe more of an actual piercing the dome tower. We just wanted to hear your general take on Rob Skiba's approach and what your take on, if one of those two options for the Tower of Babel had any authenticity to it.
Yeah, and interesting about the concept that you just mentioned about somehow piercing the dome, as in
Yes.
the dome that's in flat Earth. So, yeah, very interesting. I'll talk about maybe that part at the end.
Okay.
So that when we look at the Tower of Babel and we look at Nimrod as being the founder of Babylon and the one credited with, imposing this universal religion and being an antichrist archetype figure and building the city and building this tower, where does this knowledge come from?
Yeah.
Certainly it wouldn't be passed down from Noah and his sons, because they wouldn't want to see the knowledge that helped destroy the antediluvian world and or the religion of it that would start again, right? Because they just survived it. It was the most horrific event
Right.
what's going to happen in the end times. So yeah, you can't imagine that Noah would be a fan of that. And so this knowledge comes from somewhere, and we get an idea of this knowledge in the narrative that acting as one people with one language, that nothing that they intend to do will be prevented for them from accomplishing, paraphrasing what it says. So that means they have some great knowledge that's working together with this whatever belief system and this religion that they're now working with. And Babel is understood as a rebellious sort of period, which also suggests that they were worshiping other gods, as all of the imagery would go along with that. So let's lay the table on that. So it's interesting that from the Masonics and societies, the ancient Masonry societies, the ancient Polychronicon, and the Gnostics, is they have their own traditions about Nimrod, because he's a very important figure to them. And he is classified as one of the greatest patriarchs of Masonry.
Really?
He is thought of as the first Grand Master of Masonry after the flood, who writes its first constitution.
Yeah, even more so than Solomon.
Yes. Well, there's a debate who's greater.
Oh, really?
The craft. Yeah, they like to have
No
that
kidding.
debate. Yeah. So, yeah, so they do. They do. So they
Can you imagine to get on that
but,
debate?
yeah. But anyways,
Which one of these two awful people was
Wonder if
the
that was on
greater?
like Thanksgiving dinner.
so in this account, you have also the two legends of Lamech and Enoch of the two pillars. The two pillars of Lamech are the two pillars of Enoch. And one is, because they know the flood is coming, they want to pass on Enoch's knowledge and Enoch's religion to the post-diluvian world. So they do one pillar that is designed to survive an apocalypse by fire, and the other pillar is designed to survive an apocalypse by water. So either way, the pillar is going to be found, and on there is going to be some knowledge, but directions to where the 36,525 books of knowledge and the Enochian religion is going to be found, that was stacked on in 9 vaults, stacked on top of each other and buried below the pyramid, because the pyramid was based on the knowledge that Enoch supplied and the knowledge from the angels in terms of supplying that technology to have those pyramids built. That's what the Gnostics believe. So Hermes comes along, part of the Hermes Trismegistus,
Hermes Trismegistus,
right? And so he's a Hermes after the flood, as opposed to the ones before the flood. And he finds the pillar that obviously floated and finds the knowledge goes to the pyramids, brings this knowledge back to Nimrod, who utilizes this knowledge to build Babel City and Babel Tower. That's where the knowledge comes from. That's where the religion comes from. And they start to honor the pantheon of gods, just as everything that they're building is designed to honor this pantheon of gods. And they impose this religion on them. So this presumes some significant knowledge that they have. And it's the knowledge of the ancients. It's this powerful knowledge that had developed a society and a system that's more advanced than what we have today, and that we're just catching up to that. It now that includes DNA technology and all sorts of other technologies, and maybe different technologies than what we have. And this is thought to be the knowledge that might be applied to make Nimrod become a Gibberim, a mighty one. That it changes him because he's born of Cush. He's not born of fallen angels like the Rephaim are. So he becomes one. And that sort of, you take that back to the Hebrew word, it means to break the covenant, to break the vow. So breaking the leadership vow and rebelling and going. And so typically this is the knowledge that was provided, and they have their hands on great knowledge. To what extent, we don't know. Typically, we also know that Babel is understood through the Hebrew word, Babel, and that it means confusion of languages, because God confuses the languages that won't be brought back together to act as one people again.
Love you too, bro.
Until the end time, right? When this technology is going to be significant again, like the days of Noah was. And so, but Nimrod stays in Shinar, which is Sumer. And then he begins the Assyrians. He begins the Akkadians, and the Babylonians come from him, right? So he is sort of the patriarch to this, and he continues with the Magi and that religion, whereas Hermes takes the religion as well from Babel to Egypt, and you get the two pillars, so to speak, of polytheism after the flood, with the Magi and the Egyptian priest that spreads to the rest of the world. Okay, so the Akkadians, and there are Sumerian versions as well of the Tower of Babel. There are Armenian versions. There's actually versions in the Aztecs and in Central America.
Like flood.
Yeah, much like the flood, So that probably goes with the people leaving Babel, where that knowledge comes from, right? So, but in Akkadian, the word Babel or Babalu, as it's also understood at, has a different meaning than confusion of languages. It means Bab in Akkadian as in gateway or stargate. And El is God in Hebrew, and ILU is the same transliterated word in Mesopotamia. So it could also have been AL and other variations, but that means a gateway of the gods. Or a stargate of the gods. So the thought is that they had the technology that they were putting into the pyramids, and we don't even know what the pyramids and the ziggurats and the towers were used for in the ancient world, but there's a lot of speculation that they were some sort of machines and things like that that could do great things. And this is thought that they could go into another portal and free the Baalim and or the parent gods from the abyss to come and be like before the flood again, right? But that implies a portal as opposed to going out through the dome in the flat Earth model. And the dome is thought to be something that's almost impenetrable. Right? So let's have a look at that to see whether or not there's a correlation here. Is it a possibility, or is the abyss located in a different place like the abyss than that? And this whole dome hard structure thing. So what we do know is that the word heaven has three different meanings. It's the Hebrew word shema. Shemaim is the male plural, and it can also be used as angels, as the heavenly ones, right? And heaven is the abode of God and the angels. It's the spirit dimension. But there's also two other places in Bible, and as it's defined in Hebrew. One is the firmament, which reaches as in the flat Earth model as the dome, and everything inside that dome. and what's outside of the dome is the rest of the universe. Now, inside the dome includes the sun inwards, however far of a distance that is. But this firmament is made up of water.
Yeah.
Now, how do we know that? Because when God divided the waters, right? That's what creates the space underneath from the outer heaven to the inner heaven, and is actually called, the firmament is called heaven in Genesis 1. So this is water, very much water like is on the earth. Whether or not it becomes gaseous or something like that, or hard as ice perhaps, but it would have to be see-through ice, I guess, if it was this hard surface. But in whatever format that it's in, it's still classified as this urethra or this water that is separating the two universes.
Yeah.
So that doesn't imply that it's impenetrable to me, unless it does form into a solid that is absolutely transparent. But there'd be no reason to penetrate that dome if you're trying to let them out of the abyss. If the abyss is in the underworld, which is in the earth and probably in another dimension.
Right.
The only way that you would want to somehow sort of penetrate that is if you go with the version that Azazel was hung in Orion and not into the abyss where the rest of the angels went to. And that just falling star is Azazel that would fall to the earth to open up the abyss. Typically, the angels described in Revelation are loyal angels doing these things, who has the key to the abyss.
Right.
And there's another angel in Revelation 20 that has a key. So there's a possibility of all of that, but now you're relying on polytheism.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily a fan
House
of
built
that.
on sand.
Yeah, so there's a possibility there, but I don't think it's trying to get through the dome. But I do agree with the part that they were probably trying to do something to bring the gods back from the abyss.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing about the Tower of Babel story that is always so hard to get across to non-believers or people who don't study the Bible, who are or just non-Christians. You know, they look at it as the atheist perspective of the Tower of Babel story is God's keeping humanity down. You know, but like Nick and I were talking about it a while back, whether it was on the last live stream we did or maybe just around the campfire, that it really was a mercy that God was bestowing upon us.
Use their languages.
Yeah, to protect us from ourselves, because
he gave us he gave mankind their individualism back.
Yeah, a little bit, and smashed the empire in a way.
Yeah.
Because we have free choice. And so very quickly, but because there's so much power that's centered, you brought an end time scenario about within 100 years of the flood.
Right. Yeah, right on the heels of the last catastrophe.
So confusing the languages wasn't to put you back into a non-knowledgeable situation. It was to decentralize that power, and that people would not be able to work together until, you know, the names of the Gentiles were fulfilled that are in the book of life created before creation, right? There needed to be that time to let things sort of unfold. And the Redeemer needed to come in and save the world from our free choice in terms of forgiving our sins. But God is greater than free choice, right? So, I mean, he's Alpha Omega. He knows the beginning from the end. So, there's this, you know, separation and confusion of the language was a blessing so that we could reach our destiny.
Yeah, man, that's such a good point. That's so true, because it did. It paved the way, and it did decentralize us. And that's something that everything has been working back towards.
Yeah.
You know, is that globo homo agenda, the homogenized globalization.
Yep.
You know, of rebuilding
Just
that
one
world government,
big
one
collective.
world, yeah,
one thought, one language, one religion.
Yeah, one religion, one currency. You know, and it's like, man, we've been here before. You know, and that's that's always been the hard thing for me as someone who's into like a lot of weird stuff like that is, okay, I get the flat earth model, like I'm really tempted by that, you know. I get the whole like piercing the dome thing, but when you look at like Nephilim, and you talk about this, when you look at like Nephilim technology, you know, the Atlantean myth, all that stuff, the Stargate angle of like rending the veil,
It makes more
seems
sense.
to be a little bit. It seems to have that ring of truth, that striking that middle seam.
Yeah. Now, the one thing that you could also look at the Babel thing to do is in terms of what was trying to be done at Babel, he's an Antichrist type figure. And whether it's Antichrist or any of the other Antichrist wannabes throughout history, they're always trying to do what Satan was trying to do, is to raise their throne into heaven.
Oh, yeah.
So if they wanted to get into the spiritual dimension, they would, again, have to have a portal for that somehow, some way to do that and try and do what Satan was doing. And as Antichrist will do in the end time, there will actually be this war in heaven as described in Revelation 12, and in Daniel 8, which is a corresponding prophecy, he will throw down some of the starry host.
Yeah.
In that assault into heaven.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that Rob Skiba had talked about with the Tower of Babel being an attempt, because it's in Jubilees and one other book that escapes me at the moment, but there is this discussion amongst the people building the tower that they're going to kill God and kill all the angels and overthrow,
Hey, John, good to see you, mate.
From that.
Yeah. And there's no way you could build a tower high enough to do that. So there's something more to that.
Yeah.
So,
and that's what I think I despise the most about the original, traditional interpretation of Babel, that they tell the kids, and they don't, and the church never diverges from it. Like, no, they were actually just trying to reach a tower, literally to go all the way to heaven. Because they were primitive, simple, stupid,
and they
people.
just wanted to be in heaven.
But they could build something we couldn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
That's how stupid they were.
Well, and it's this whole idea, like, we started as slime, we started as slime and we've evolved. Look how far we've evolved. Look at our technology. Look how far we've come. And I think it's the opposite. I think we've been devolving since Adam was kicked out of Eden.
Oh,
I think we were a lot. I think we're on a
entropy. I mean, there is a case for entropy.
Humanity.
Everything degrades over time, and it's just a matter of whether or not you can reconstruct it, or you can slow down the aging process, whatever that is.
And it's not that knowledge is neither good nor evil. It's how it's used that decides it, right?
Yeah.
And the trouble is the knowledge without proper guidance and wisdom is always used for evil.
Always. When we get you back, Gary, towards the end of the summer, hopefully, I'd love to ask what your take on the Garden of Eden, and we don't have time for it obviously today because we've already dragged you out for a half hour longer than we were supposed to, because Gary's such a gentleman. But I would like to talk to you about the Garden of Eden.
That's John speaking now, guys.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and because that's another thing that like the atheists use to say, see, God's just keeping you down. It's like, no, there's probably more to it than that, and I think there are a lot of stories that are like that. So man, it's been awesome.
This has been awesome, and you've been with us for half an hour longer than you
I know.
committed to.
Sorry.
And I think
we almost got to all of our
really
questions.
Yeah,
we almost made it.
Amazing, which is amazing. But this has been great, and I understand you're going to be taking a break for a couple months, and I hope it's
still doing phone interviews. Correct.
Yeah, still doing audio.
And still writing, right? Finishing the sequel.
Yeah.
And hope that goes well, and we look forward to doing this again, hopefully in the future. And hopefully the world will still be spinning and not completely burned to the ground by then. We'll see.
We'll see.
But I actually am going to email you to get that document about.
I'll send it.
Putin.
I'll send it to you.
Man, that'd be great.
And John, Gary Wayne is very humble. I seen him on show channels that only have like 1,000 subs and that, so he's very humble.
Hey, I really, really want to read that.
Yeah,
that'd be fantastic.
Gary Wayne, we love you, buddy. This is always
Thank
awesome.
you
We're
so
so
much.
blessed to have you.
Yeah.
Author of the Genesis
Amen.
6 Conspiracy. You can find it on Amazon, of course. You can order it through your local booksellers, or we highly recommend you go to the Genesis6conspiracy.com and order a signed copy from Gary. If you have any questions about any information that he has, Gary, you're so generous with your time and your information.
Amen.
You're awesome. You're a national treasure,
Yep.
and I'm so jealous that Canada has you and not the U.S.
Oh, it's
And
Canadian.
we hope you catch a big fish up there at your cabin over the
yes.
summer.
Many
I'll catch a few.
Awesome.
Great interview, guys. He's Canadian. I didn't know that. Okay, I'll play a couple of Jews finding Christ testimonies. They're pretty touching, I think.
Of a second PhD. And the more that I studied the Hebrew Bible, the more I studied how the New Testament is reading the Old Testament, the more I realized that Jesus is the Messiah. I grew up in New Jersey, very well aware of our Jewish identity. I do remember that whenever my dad was really, really angry, the worst thing he could ever say was Jesus Christ. My mom started to become more and more spiritual. She started to read the Bible. She started to read the Old Testament, what we called it, or the Hebrew Bible. She became more and more curious intellectually with Jesus. She came home with the very good news to tell my father, Murray, I've been searching the scriptures, I've been reading, I've been studying, and Jesus is the Messiah. My father started to cry. He said, I thought I married a Jew. How could you betray our people? How could you do this? Please tell me, why do you believe in Jesus? But please don't show me the New Testament. Because of course we knew Christians hate Jews. Christians believe in the New Testament. The New Testament must be anti-Semitic. As she read to him Isaiah 53, my father got very angry. And he stopped her and he said, I told you, Lorraine, I don't want to hear the New Testament. And she said,
Yeah, Isaiah 53, that's the clincher. Any Jew who reads that scripture and doesn't believe Christ is the Savior, men are always destined for hell.
stopped and she said, well, Murray, this is our side of the book. This is not the New Testament. This is a prophecy from 700 years before Jesus was born. Well, my father was in shock. Over the next several months, something very strange had happened in our family. So suddenly, up until that point, my mom and dad felt very insistent upon sending me to Hebrew school. They were very clear about our Jewish identity. And now suddenly they start to talk to me about Jesus. And it was very confusing to me. I didn't understand. I thought that my mom and dad had an identity crisis. Something definitely was wrong with them. And I remember them bringing me to a service.
Hey,
My
Barry,
mom and
good
dad
to see you,
decided to
mate.
go back to the house. I was with my mom's friend Linda in her car. It was a blue Mercedes, and we're driving home. And she says to me, so Seth, when are you going to accept Yeshua as your Messiah? I didn't know quite what to say, but I said, Linda, I said, give me a break. I'm young. I want to live a little. I want to experience life. I want to enjoy. And she looked at me, she said, Seth, did you know that Jesus could come back at any moment now? I said, okay. Now we're on the highway, we're driving. She said, he could come back at any moment. I said, okay, so what? She said, well, you know what would happen if he came back right now? I said, no. I would be taken up and I'd be with Jesus forever. And you would be in the passenger seat of my car going 55 miles per hour all alone without a driver, and you would crash, die, and go to hell. This is true. Jesus, don't come back. Jesus, don't come back. Jesus, don't come back. I was bleeding. Don't come back. And so that was when my prayer life began. I had very, very serious childhood asthma. I was on heavy medications. One of the medications I was on was called prednisone. And prednisone was something that deeply affected my moods. It also affected my shape. I remember looking in the mirror and I was fat. My face was swollen up. It was red. I already
Prednisol's a steroid. That's why he was having mood swings.
believed in my heart of hearts that I was an ugly kid. I was the ugliest kid in my class. And so I grew up seeing myself as ugly. And then with the prednisone, I just remember detesting myself. There's nothing worse in the world than to look at the mirror and see yourself as ugly. And again, it wasn't just an ugliness of my physical appearance. It was the ugliness of my inability to overcome my own weaknesses, my inability to free myself from sin. I was convinced that God hated me too. And I started to see that I was ugly in God's eyes. And so I went through this never-ending cycle of praying. And so it was as if I would be born again, and then born again again, and then born again again, and born again again. And no matter what I did, no matter how I prayed, this dread sense of terror that I was a dirty, rotten sinner, ugly in God's eyes, that God hated me, and that the first chance he was going to send me to hell. And it really scared me. And I had no hope. Several years later, I found myself in this service. And the speaker, he was a pastor, and for whatever reason, he kept looking my way. And it was odd because he didn't know me, and there were a couple hundred people there, and he kept looking at me, and it felt like he was exposing all the things I hope nobody else would see around me, all the things I hated about myself, all the things I believe God hated about me. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm very uncomfortable. And at the end of the service, I just remember him just inviting people to stand up. I stood up, and I looked forward. And it's as if I saw Yeshua waiting for me. And his arms were stretched out. And up until that moment, his arms were always stretched out in anger. He wanted to strike me down. But this time, for the first time, his arms were open. And all he wanted to do was to hug me. All he wanted to do is embrace me. And it was as if I heard, I did this for you. These scars are for you. These wounds are for you. Of course I love you. Of course I accept you. I came for sinners. And I guess it was the first time that I recognized that Yeshua loves sinners. And I think for the first time in my life, I no longer saw myself as ugly. I no longer believed that lie that I was ugly in God's eyes. And for the first time, I actually truly felt loved from the inside out. And I knew that God loved me. The chains broke. I was new. I was free. Well, as I started to get more and more excited about the fact that I was a new creation, that it was something that God did supernaturally, I wanted to share. And one of the things that started happening is I shared with my family, wait a minute, you believe in Jesus and you're Jewish? This just can't be. And in fact, you're saying that Jesus is the Messiah based on the Old Testament. Who do you think you are? Do you know better than the rabbis? In fact, if you really could read Hebrew, you would know that you're misreading the text, that Jesus couldn't be the Messiah. You're trusting on a Christian translation. I remember thinking to myself, you know what? I have to know biblical Hebrew, and I have to know it really, really well. After I finished my first PhD, I started another PhD in Hebrew Bible here in Israel. I can put all of my intellectual weight on the text itself. And the more that I studied the Hebrew Bible, the more I studied how the New Testament is reading the Old Testament, the more I realized that Jesus is the Messiah. This is true not just on a heart level, not just because I know that God has redeemed me from my sin, not just because I know that he's given me a new life and hope, and that I know that I'm beautiful in his eyes, not because of me, but because of him. But there's the other side of it. It's the head side of it, that God calls us as a people to search the scriptures, to study, to see if in fact Jesus is the Messiah. And I'm convinced with all my heart, to the extent that I've studied all these years, that to understand Moses, to understand the prophets, to understand the writings is, in fact, to see Yeshua, the greatest Jew who ever lived, the Savior of our people and the Savior of the world.
What happens after you die? We weren't even allowed to go to the funeral. I remember asking my teacher in synagogue, what happens after we die? And she didn't really know. She said, go see the rabbi. So I met with the rabbi, and I remember him telling me the story about a man climbing up a mountain, and he's only seeing the trees, and he's journeying up the mountain, and never sees what's over the other side because he's climbing the mountain. But God, who is at the top of the mountain, sees over the other side of the mountain. And that was my rabbi's answer. The rabbi had no more idea than I did what happens after you die. He didn't know. I went on to university, and those two driving issues remained in my mind. Why am I here? I'm here for a purpose. And what's going to happen to me after I die? I got involved in drugs and rock and roll. I started to go to Grateful Dead concerts and doing drugs, and that was, I guess, sort of a hobby for me. But there was something spiritual about that experience, the drugs and the music. And I knew very clearly from my drug experiences that there's more to this life than just what we see. There's a world beyond this world. So through college, I'm exploring. I'm involved in these cults and the occult, and I'm searching for God. A friend of mine had really gotten heavily involved in drugs, and I saw her lose interest in classes. She stopped attending classes. She disappeared from my life. She really looked like she was dying from using drugs. She was suicidal. She was considering taking her life, until one day I was walking on campus and I bumped into her, and her name was Susie. I said, "Susie, what happened to you?" Because she was smiling, she was vibrant, she looked terrific. And she began to tell me that something profound happened. She had wandered into a pool hall, and the owner of the hall had just become a Christian. And he witnessed her and he told her about Jesus, and she had prayed with him to accept Jesus. And now she was born again. Her life had completely been transformed. And I said to her, "I'm really happy for you, Susie. That's great. It's not for me, but if it makes you happy, that's great." And then she invited me to a Bible study. And I wanted to say no, but somehow out of my mouth, I said yes. And it was pouring rain, and I had a motorcycle. And I thought, I have a good excuse not to go to this Bible study. But I remember getting on the back of the motorcycle and driving through the pouring rain to this Bible study that I didn't want to go to. And I remember walking into the study, I was soaking wet, my clothes were soaked. But from the time that the Bible study started, and I don't even remember what was taught, it was the book of Revelation and how the world's coming to an end. But I just thought, I want to get out of here. But I couldn't because my clothes were in the dryer. So I was a captive audience. And at the end of the Bible study, the teacher invited me to go upstairs and talk with him. He gave me a Bible, and he began to take me through these scriptures in my own Jewish Bible to begin with, and then in the New Testament about sin and separation from God. I had never read the Bible before other than preparation for my bar mitzvah. We Jews are supposed to be the people of the book, but most Jewish people have never even read.
Diane, Genesis 6 Conspiracy by Gary Wayne at gmail.com. Is that it? I know it is something like that.
The scriptures that we claim to be our own. And as he showed me verses about my sin and separation from God, like all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Our righteousness is as filthy rags. And I just felt the weight of my sin. I was hot. The room was bright. I felt the presence of what I knew to be God himself. And so I prayed this prayer with him. And as soon as I prayed, the room went back to normal temperature. The lights went back to normal. The sofa that felt like it was holding me in place released me. The Bible shrunk back to a normal size. My clothes were presented to me dry. I changed and I raced home and tried to forget this experience. But something changed in my heart that night. And I had a desire for the first time to read the Bible. I had never read the Bible before. I claimed to believe the Bible, but I didn't really know what the Bible said other than the stories that I had learned growing up. And I just devoured the Bible. And I began with the book of Matthew. I had never read the New Testament. I was taught that the New Testament was the Christian Bible. The only connection that it had with my heritage as a Jew is that it was anti-Semitic. And much of Judaism, as we wandered through Europe, and other nations was an effort to survive in what became a Christian world. Christianity was defined by its hatred of the Jewish people and blaming the Jewish people for almost 2,000 years now. So for a Jew to consider Jesus, there's really a terrible history to overcome. But I really felt this pull to read the New Testament. And I began in Matthew chapter 1. Right in the beginning, it listed the genealogy of Jesus. Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David. And that just jumped out at me. And I immediately it was shocking. What is Abraham and David, two of the greatest men in our history, doing in the Christian Bible? I discovered things that were completely different than I had been taught growing up. I discovered that Jesus was Jewish, that he had a given name, a Hebrew name, Yeshua, which means salvation, because he will save his people from their sins. I discovered that he was born in Israel of Jewish parents. I thought he grew up in Rome, in the Vatican.
Thanks, John. Thanks, brother. Jay Dyer, I was waiting for him to go do another video. He done a video 2 days ago, and I put my Auslink up and what the names mean, because you know what I mean there, John. And what happened, they're hiding my comment. They're not. He's not seen it, because what I typed, an hour later I look back and everyone else had love hearts next to him like he liked it, and I kept checking back in, and it didn't get one thumbs up, so he's not seeing it. So I'm going to do it with my girlfriend's, her YouTube, and do it from her account, because I think they hide my link sometimes if it's from me.
All of the first followers of Yeshua were all Jews, and none of them converted to another religion. They didn't convert to Christianity. There was no Christianity. No, they were Jewish men and women who had found their promised Messiah from their own scriptures, the Tanakh. And that changed my life. I began to find the answers that I had been looking for in my own scriptures, in the Tanakh. I discovered that God had a purpose for my life, and that purpose was to know him, to walk with him, to serve him. I discovered that there is a life after this life. I knew almost immediately that God was calling me, that he had a destiny for my life to serve him full time. I ended up moving to Russia after leading a Messianic congregation from a number of years in upstate New York, and then began to work in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, throughout Africa. And for the last number of years, we've been providing medical clinics where we provide dental care, eye care, medicines, even surgeries, free of charge. We just do it to serve and to let people know that God loves them. And my brother was a photographer. That's one of the things that he did. And I was able to bring him to Ethiopia as our photographer to one of our medical clinics. And he experienced in that clinic the presence of God as lives were being changed. He was photographing everything, and he saw people not only being cared for, but he saw people being changed by the love of God. And I watched him. I had the joy of watching him go through the same experience I did as he received Jesus, Yeshua, into his life, and was completely transformed. He passed away from cancer fairly recently, but I know where he is today, and I'll be seeing him again. This is my destiny. This is my heritage. This Yeshua is my Messiah promised in my own scriptures.
Okay, guys, give me a sec. Sid Roth's got one up there. Where are you, Sid? There he is.
I'm hearing voices. There's a demon inside. that opened up a door that I wanted to close, that I didn't know who to go to close it. My parents, they'd send me to a rabbi. A rabbi couldn't help. Rabbi, I'm hearing voices. There's a demon inside. You know what he'd do? He'd send me to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist, when you're on a sugar like that, they didn't know what to do. So they would give you electric shock treatment. And then you'd really be Meshuggah. And I'm a Jew, so I'm not going to go to a priest or something. Death looked better to me than life. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. I went to the synagogue faithfully until I was bar mitzvah, and I couldn't wait to get out of the synagogue, but I did go on the high holidays with my parents. If you said to me, did I believe in God? I would have said, I guess as a Jew, I'm supposed to say yes, but I don't know. And I quickly learned that I could be happy if I made $1 million. I had a degree from a major university in the United States. I had a job with the largest stock brokerage firm in the world at that time. So I did something I'm not proud of. I left my job, I left my wife, I left my daughter, and I got involved in what was called a New Age meditation course. I was told that they would teach me how to know things that were not programmed in my brain. And then I thought, well, if I could know this information from the invisible world, then I could know what stocks are going to go up. Then I could make $1 million in the market. Then I could be happy. So I took this course, and I actually didn't think it would work. They told me how to mentally slow down my brain waves through mental exercise. And then when I'm in a passive, almost a hypnotic state, I could invite an imaginary friend into my head. And this imaginary friend would give me information that had been never programmed into my brain. So I went along with it. I'll tell you, between you and me, why I went along with it. They said they'd give me my money back if it didn't work. So I figured I'd do everything they said. I knew it wasn't going to work, but it did. And I knew things that had not been programmed in my mind. And I thought, oh, I'm now going to be happy. And the power actually started growing. And then I got involved in something called astral projection. That's where your spirit leaves your body. But then I found out once your spirit leaves your body, every night that you go to sleep, your spirit goes for a spirit walk. What if my spirit left my body and didn't make it back in time? I'd be buried alive. And I have to tell you, I was so fearful that I couldn't even sleep. And I was convinced that what was inside of me was evil. It was actually a demon. I have tasted the power of the dark side, of the demonic world. And contrary to popular opinion, it's not fake. There are genuine supernatural things that are miraculous. Death looked better to me than life. Life was too hard. I wasn't looking for God. I wasn't looking for religion. I was just looking to go back to the way I was. I'd opened up a door that I wanted to close, and I didn't know how to close it, and I didn't know who to go to close it. For instance, my parents would give their life for me, but they couldn't help me. They'd send me to a rabbi. A rabbi couldn't help get, Rabbi, I'm hearing voices. There's a demon inside. You know what he'd do? He'd send me to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist, when you're on a sugar like that, they didn't know what to do. So they would give you electric shock treatment, and then you'd really be Meshuggah. And I'm a Jew, so I'm not going to go to a priest or something. I knew there was nowhere I could go. I was told there was a greater power than that devil that was pulling me under, that demon inside of me. And that power was the name of Jesus. Did I believe in him? No. But did I have nowhere else to go? I had nowhere else to go. And at that time, I'd been given a Bible by these Christian businessmen. We Jews have nothing to do with the New Testament. We Jews have nothing to do with the church. You know, when you're sinking in the middle of the ocean, you don't care who throws you a rope. In desperation, I prayed a 2-word prayer. Jesus, help. I really didn't want to wake up. Life was too difficult. Well, I did wake up the next morning, and I couldn't believe what happened. That demonic thing that was inside of me, it was gone. Totally gone. And replaced with the greatest peace and love a human could have. I could not be afraid and fearful if you gave me $1 million, because this love conquered all of my fear. It was a love that I never experienced. I'd never felt before. And I returned to my wife and daughter, and my marriage was restored. And I can tell you that Joy and I have celebrated our 53rd wedding anniversary. My dad was angry with me the entire time that I became a believer, all of those years. You can't be two things. You can't be Jewish and a believer in Jesus. He wanted nothing to do with Christians, and he was really ashamed that his son was a public believer in the Messiah.
Wow.
My mother observed how my marriage was restored, how I became a good husband, a good father, a good provider. And she said, you know, I don't believe in this Yeshua, but Yeshua made my son a mensch. That means a good human being. I discussed with her why I believed in Yeshua. And one day she said a prayer to know the Messiah. And then when my mom died, my father asked the most important question he could ask me. He said, Sid, will you go to the synagogue for almost a year with me and say Kaddish for your mother? And just as I was going to say, no, Dad, I don't have time, I've heard the voice of God. And I felt God said, yes, tell him yes. And you know, I went with my father every day to the minyan, and I said the Kaddish, and I put on the tefillin. One day, my father said, because I was being such a good son in his mind, do you still believe in him? And I said, yes, Dad, I do. I believe the blood of Yeshua washes away my mistakes, and I am clean. I opened up my Tanakh, and I read the 53rd chapter of Isaiah to him. It says, we Jewish people reject him, but he won't die for his own sins. He'll die for our sins, and by his stripes, by the blood that'll flow from him, we will be healed. My dad said, stop. You're reading from a Christian Bible. You're talking about that man. And I thought to myself, isn't that amazing? I am reading from a Jewish Bible, and he thinks I'm talking about Yeshua. I tell you, God is wonderful. He restored my life. He restored my family. My entire mishpacha came to know the Messiah. I owe everything to Yeshua, and I'm one grateful Jewish man.
It's dark. It was just after a snowstorm, and I'm heading to a train track. Then I see a light to my left. It was coming head on. The train comes, it plows, smashes into the fourth pinto, and I didn't get a scratch. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish home. My father grew up in Germany under Hitler. Then came Kristallnacht, the night of
Good night,
broken
Diane.
glasses. He can remember
God
his
bless.
father taking him through the rubble and seeing all this, and his father said, we have to get you out. Something came to pass called the Kinder transport. They put them on trains, ultimately
John, have you seen his Shemitah Mysteries?
going to England. And his father, when he was saying goodbye to his mother's crying, you may never see her again. and you may never see us again. And he never did.
Oh, man.
His father ultimately stayed behind getting other Jews out, and then he escaped miraculously. A Jewish family sponsored him to get him out, and
Okay, John, I'll post a link, but I'll tell you what it's about first. He links the historic rise and fall of nations. He links that to the Shemitah cycle, and he does it, and the numbers don't lie. And this guy brought me to God, because when he explained the Shemitah mysteries, the numbers don't lie, and it was absolutely stunning, and it brought me to God because it convicted my mind and not my heart, because the Gentiles search for knowledge, the Jews search for signs, and it was his knowledge that brought me to God. I'll post a link. It's really worth watching.
even to go to college,
Hang
and he studied chemistry, and then
Jonathan
to get his
Carr,
PhD, he
Shemitah
came down
mysteries.
to America, where my mother was also studying for her PhD in chemistry. They fell in love, and they decided to get married. The house wasn't religious. It was secular, kind of normal American Jewish home. I remember being in Hebrew school and watching the film strips of David and Isaiah and Elijah, and the reality of God. God was so real in what they told us of the Bible. He spoke to people. He moved on their lives. Whether it was Moses in the burning bush or Abraham being called by God, there was a big gap between what I saw of the living, breathing God of Israel, the God of the Bible, and what I saw in the synagogue. In the synagogue, I never saw anybody saying, wow, God, he changed my life. It never happened. The rabbi never said, hey, the Lord just led me today, and I never happened. It was more liturgy and more rituals. It was kind of like the echoes of what once was. It was that there once was a glory, but the glory wasn't there, the presence wasn't there. It was more a cultural thing. People went to synagogue because they were Jewish. This is what we do because of tradition. You know, we went to Yom Kippur, and at the end of it, people didn't come out saying, wow, you know, my sins are cleansed. You know, there was none of that. There was no sense of the reality of God, or the assurance of God, or the presence of God, or the life-changing power that's in the Bible. Therefore, I'm questioning the whole thing. How do I know there's a God? I don't see the evidence. How do I know he exists? How do I know we were the first ones to find there was one God, which is what we were taught? Tradition isn't God. It may be nice, but that's not God. And what people have told me is not God either. And even if they're religious, and that's not it either. I have to find God for myself. I have to find the truth for itself. I started seeking to get books on anything I could, on every subject, on science, on religion, on UFOs, on the occult, on every religion, every ideology, everything I could. And one day I picked up a book, and it was the late great planet Earth, from ancient times. So the prophecies of Israel, that the Jewish people are going to be scattered to the ends of the earth, and they were. And then that they, in the end times, they'd be gathered back to the land of Israel, and they were. And that the world would focus on the controversy of Israel and the Middle East and Jerusalem. And I never heard anything like that. It just blew me away. I had no idea the Bible said that it was there. And as someone who was of a scientific outlook, I could not argue against it. There's no way I could disprove it, because I knew that even with all our computers and supercomputers, we could not foretell history. Then as I'm doing that, I started reading the prophecy of the Jewish Messiah. In Micah, it says he'll be born in Bethlehem. And I'm thinking, Bethlehem? That's Catholic. How did that get into our Bible? And then I'm reading about the Messiah in Zechariah, that he's going to come to Jerusalem riding a donkey. I said, well, I heard about that, something like Palm Sunday, but what's that doing here? It said that he would be a light to the Gentiles, and he'll even be rejected by my own people for a time. And then I read in Isaiah 53 that it said that the Messiah, our Messiah, is going to die for our sins. And I always thought of something like that's Catholic, that's not Jewish, but it was there clearly. And I'm trying not to connect it, but it's connecting. I didn't want to accept it, but I couldn't argue against it. If I'm seeing this Yeshua in the Hebrew scriptures, I will have to see something Jewish in the New Testament or New Covenant scriptures. So finally, I get to the point where I'm going to open up what I know is the New Testament, and this is a forbidden book. I'm expecting something Catholic, I'm expecting something so foreign. Nevertheless, I open it up and I read the genealogy of Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then it goes down all these Hebrew names and all the Jewish names. And then as I'm reading it, he's quoting from the Hebrew scriptures again. That's just what I would expect the Messiah to do. And it clearly upholds Israel. It says in the New Testament, you have to bless the Jewish people, love the Jewish people. That's what I found. Surprise. I knew, ultimately, listen, it's not enough to be telling people about the prophecies. Ultimately, it's me and God. But I'm not following God, and I didn't want to follow God because I thought if I follow God, I have to join a monastery, become a monk. I thought you have to give up everything good or everything you enjoy to follow God. And so I fought God on this, and I knew I had to do something. So finally, I made a deal with God. And the deal I made with him was, listen, I said, I know I should follow you, but I don't want to. So here's the deal. I will accept you when I'm on my deathbed. I'm driving in this Ford Pinto at night, and I'm heading to a train track. It's dark. It was just after a snowstorm. Came at an angle. The road was bumpy. You didn't even know where you were. And I see a light to my left. But the other cars are crossing. And I was on the track. It was coming head on. The train comes. It plows, smashes into the Ford Pinto. The car goes up like aluminum foil. And the only thing I could do at that point was call out to God. And the car was destroyed. And it made headlines. And I didn't get a scratch. I said, Lord, that was so close. I realized that my life was so close, within inches of eternity. I said, I got to get right with God. And I didn't know how to do it. I remember from Hebrew school that Moses met God on a mountain and Elijah met God on a mountain. I said, so let me find a mountain. So here it was night, and I drove my car up this mountain. I'd never been there before. And there I found a rock. I kneeled down on the rock and I said, Lord, I'm yours in the name of Messiah. I know he is the Messiah. Come into my life, cleanse me, forgive me, make me new, and lead me on. From this moment, I'm going to follow you as your disciple. I remember that first week, I felt something different. It was very gentle, but it was real. I was going to college, and I was working as a security guard. And this cleaning man at this factory, and he looks at me and he says, what happened to you? He says, you got that glow. You're glowing. And I was glowing. I was born again. When you follow him in Messiah, your life becomes what it was meant to be from the beginning.
Amen.
Because my parents were raised traditionally in many ways that whatever you do, you can't believe in Jesus and be Jewish. And so one day I spoke to them and I said, here, I'm gonna read to you these scriptures. So I read the Messiah being born in Bethlehem. They said, oh, that's obviously Jesus. It's the New Testament. I'm sure of it. Dying for our sins. That's the New Testament. Light to the Gentiles, New Testament. Riding on a donkey, New Testament. I said, everything I read to you was from the Hebrew scriptures. It was simply speaking of the Messiah to come. And there was dead silence. And then my father kind of said, well, that doesn't mean anything. What you're reading about in the New Testament is a rabbi. A rabbi can say, this is kosher and this is not kosher. But the mega rabbi, the grand rabbi, is the one who can make those who are not kosher become kosher. He can take those who are born of the nations and make them spiritually children of Israel. He can even take us in our uncleanness and our sins and make us clean. See, what is the ultimate hope of Israel? The ultimate hope of the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, is that God and man will become joined together forever. It's about the covenant. That's what Israel's about, the covenant, God and man. Well, what is the ultimate of that? The ultimate is that the Lord God comes and becomes one with us, that he can know our sorrows, know our pain, know our sins, and still be one with us. That is what the Messiah is. He's the joining of God and man. It's not just that Jesus and believing in him, Messiah, Yeshua, is Jewish, but it's the most Jewish thing that you could ever do. Whether you're Jewish or not, it's the most Jewish thing, and it's the best thing. Listen, I am the least likely person in the world to be telling you what I've been telling you. Seek for yourself. I was raised with a scientific outlook to research, see whether something is true or not. It's not about religion. It's not about tradition. It's not about what people told you. In the end, it's only going to be about you and God. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and the door shall be open. Ask, and it will be given. God is there to show himself to you. Seek him, and you will find.
I grew up in the synagogue. I knew of nothing else. As a matter of fact, I had very few friends who were not Jewish. There was a lot of racial tension in our city. So I was in about the 4th or 5th grade, and this friend of mine, Larry, came up to me. Out of the clear blue sky, he pointed his finger at me and says, "You killed Jesus." And I said, "I don't even know who you're talking about." I was really scared. I mean, me? How could I? I mean, I was a young child. One of the people I connected with, who was a very good friend of mine, was from Miami Beach. And he was a guitarist, and I was a drummer. So we connected right away. He said, "So would you like to do some drugs?" And I go, "No, I don't know." And he said, "Let's try it." What is this stuff? I mean, it was like the most incredible feeling I've ever felt. This is what I want to do for my life. I want to be a musician. I was just having the time of my life, not being home, being away. Kind of left my Jewish roots back at the house. So we showed up at this club and we set up our equipment. Attached to the club was a cafe, and there was this really, really cute girl. And I tell you, my eyes just went boom. I said, "I'm going to marry this girl." And I said, "Hey, how would you like to come with me?" She goes, "Okay." And I had our first child within a few years. We were immersed back into the congregation, back into that synagogue that I grew up in as a kid, and that my family was instrumental in starting. We do business. I'm in the scrap metal business, and we do business with this fellow, and his name was Sam. His wife's name was Louise, and they were the sweetest little Jewish couple you'd want to meet. Monica and I take a trip to Vermont. On the way back from Vermont, we stop and see Sam and Louise at their house because they invited us. Louise, I've never met her before, but she's this real cute little Jewish lady, and she started talking about the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua. She was like, "You gotta hear about this. It's changed my life." She says, "You've never heard of Yeshua?" And I says, "No, I've never heard of Yeshua." And she says, "Well, I bet you've heard of him as Jesus." Louise, stop right there. I says, "I'm Jewish. I don't believe in Jesus. I was intrigued about this Yeshua guy, but this Jesus, no, it's not for me." So, but thank you, Louise. Thank you very much. Right about that time, I started having a real drug and alcohol problem. Whatever pain I was in or feeling, it would take that away. My dad passed away at a very young age. He was like 52 years old and died from cancer. Just gotten divorced a couple of years before that. And I mean, all this stuff was caving in on me. I had to drive myself to the emergency room because I was thinking I was having a heart attack. And as I was driving home, there was a stretch of road that usually had a lot of truck and car traffic in the middle of the week. I said to myself, I'm done with this. I can't take it anymore. I'm going to end my life. I'm going to kill myself. The first truck that I see coming towards me, I'm history. I'm done. I wasn't even thinking about the truck driver. I wasn't even thinking about anybody but myself. I was just wanting to kill that pain permanently. And in 2 to 3 miles, there was not one car or not one truck. I get home, and my wife says to me, "What are you doing home? It's the middle of the day. You don't understand. You have no clue." And I took her engagement ring and her wedding ring, and I threw it across the room. I didn't know what was happening. I was out of my mind. I was just gone. And she was saying, what do you want from me? What do you want from me? And all of a sudden I felt this emotional thing. And I opened my mouth, and out of my mouth came these words, I just need to be loved. And I go running at the end of the hall is our door to our bedroom. And I go through that door and I shut the door, and boom, I hear the door crack. And I jump into bed and I just start screaming, God, help me. I'll do anything, God. Just stop this pain. Just stop this pain. I couldn't take it anymore. I was going crazy. And my wife walked in the room and says, your psychologist is on the phone. He wants to talk to you. Yeah, what's going on? He goes, no, you tell me what's going on. And I said, well, I'm just having a bad moment here. He goes, according to your wife, you're having a very bad moment. He says, I want to see you first thing tomorrow morning in my office, and you're going to need to go to rehab. So I go to this rehab, and I get a sponsor. She said, part of the journey of recovery is spiritual recovery. So she says, I want you to start going back to your synagogue. But I would be faithful. I'd go every Friday night. I would be going to the
Good night,
service.
Wyatt. God
They asked me
bless.
to be on the board of directors. And I said, okay, I'll be on the board of directors. And after a while on the board of directors, they said, we'd like you to be vice president. And I said, okay, I'll be vice president. After a couple of years, they said, okay, we'd like you to be president of the synagogue. And I said, okay, I'll be president of the synagogue. So here I am, president of the synagogue. I was sober at that point 10 years. My wife was having some issues on her own with drinking at that point. One day I just said, you know, Monica, I think I'm done. I think we're done. I think we should get a divorce. Something happened to Monica. All of a sudden she was like starting to go in on Sundays with a Bible under her arm and heading off to a church. I says, just don't tell him your last name because you know I'm the president of the synagogue. She goes, okay, don't worry. And I picked up the phone. I said, Sam, I got a problem. He goes, what is it? I'm president of the synagogue. Monica's going to a church, you know, on Sunday morning. We're getting divorced. I said, you know all about this Jesus stuff. Tell me, what do I do? Do you have a Bible? And I says, yeah, I have my Bar Mitzvah Bible. You know, at synagogue, we read out of a Siddur, and we never even open the Bible. I mean, the closest thing we get is the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. Turn to Isaiah 53. I turned to Isaiah 53. Turn to Psalm 2. And I said, okay. Flipped it over, found Psalm 2. Turn to Psalm 22. And I said, okay, turn to Psalm 22. Read that. What do you think they're talking about? I mean, if you're asking me, it sounds like they're talking about Jesus, but how could they? This is my Jewish Bible I got from my Bar Mitzvah. Well, why do you think they're not talking about Jesus? And I said, well, he was Catholic, right? No. He was Jewish. And I said, really? Ask God tonight what the truth is. So here I am lying in bed that night, and I'm like, okay, God, I heard some really strange stuff tonight, but I do know that you pulled me out of the drug and alcohol addiction. You saved my life. I'll believe whatever you say. So I heard these words like he was standing next to me. This is the truth, and I love you. And I started crying. So we go to the Rosh Hashanah service at their congregation, like an hour and a half away. I felt something there. I felt like love and acceptance, and I felt like I was home. And then the service started, and I couldn't stop crying. Towards the end of the service, the rabbi gets up and asks if anybody would like to accept Yeshua into their heart. I was like, yeah, I do. But you know, then I thought about it. I said, well, I'm president of the synagogue. And all of a sudden I felt a tap on my shoulder, and it was Louise. And she says, God's waiting for you. He's always been waiting for you. Just reach out to him. I never thought I could be Jewish and believe in Jesus. I thought the two were entirely at opposite ends of the spectrum. But once I understood that Jesus was Jewish, it came full circle to me. I said, oh my God, I'm believing in a Jewish Messiah. It was a gift. It was a gift that I didn't even deserve. But he loved me so much. And he loves us all so much. And he loves you so much.
Amen.
Just ask him for the truth. That's all. Just ask him for the truth. What is the truth? When I cried out to God the Father, He saved my life. When I said that prayer to accept Yeshua, Jesus.
My name is Shmuel Eliezer ben Moshe Nadler. I grew up in New York City, so you'll pardon me, I'm still learning English. But growing up there, I had a lot of questions. How could we believe in a good God who allowed such a horror, a Holocaust, to happen to our people? The rabbi, a very dear and sweet and gentle man, he said, Shmuel, the only thing I can tell you is what I tell myself. He who believes cannot question, and he who questions really cannot believe. Well, that didn't help me at all. And so I went from appearing very religious growing up to then becoming quite rebellious in a sense. I was a map maker for the U.S. Army in Vietnam. During the Battle of Tet, we were under such attack. Horrors were going on. Either you were on drugs or you were drunk. My commander of my unit, he thought he was like John Wayne, and he had scotch in his canteen, and he was drinking scotch. He passed out just before the battle began. Some of the sergeants got so overwrought they were breaking down crying in the bunkers. You know, they say there's no atheists in the foxholes. And so even though I was pretty sure there was no God whatsoever, the whole thing was like idiocy, you know, the opiate of the people. But because of the kind of horrors that go on in warfare all the time, I might have been interested to hear some good news, even in Vietnam there. And the chaplain comes by, and all he said was, I'm getting out of here, but good luck to you. Some of you won't be here in the morning. I thought, this is a religious person. You know, they were bringing troops through and going on to other areas of deployment. And so they were sleeping out in the open, and we were under attack all the time, incoming missiles. And I remember saying, you know, to the officer in charge, I said, listen, let them sleep in the barn because at least they'll have some protection. And the officer said, no, they don't have the clearance to sleep in the barn with the maps. The next morning, all there was a puddle of blood, puddles of blood from these fellas. And all I could think of was the heartache. War is a horrific thing. Horrific thing. I was what might be considered politely in English an unregistered pharmacist, a drug dealer, not particularly kosher. I would run into people who had the nerve to be on the streets of San Francisco proclaiming this Messiah, Jesus. I was a little bit off-put by it because they smiled too much. I didn't think that people should smile that much. Who could be that happy? But one of them, one night, had the nerve to try to tell me that I needed to believe in Jesus. I felt so offended. Let me tell you why. I thought, oh my goodness, they want me to go to the side of our enemy. It turns out that he said he was Jewish. My heart broke for him. I thought, a Jew who believes this? This has to be the dumbest Jew who ever lived. What kind of Jew believes in such narishkeit, such foolishness? He invited me to go to what he called a Bible study. I thought maybe it was like an archaeological find. They have a Bible, they'll look at it from different sides. I couldn't figure out what that might be. I would go there to laugh at them. I thought it would be my evening entertainment. Now, I got there, and there was a pretty ordinary-looking group of people. Each one had a Bible. I thought that was pretty interesting. They each had their own Bible. But they were taking everything so seriously. What do they think? These are God's love letters to them?
Yep.
And the portion that they were looking at was in the prophets, in Isaiah chapter 53. In traditional Judaism, where we don't study Isaiah 53, that portion is skipped over by our rabbis. They wanted me to give my opinion of who I thought the prophet was talking about. Give me a minute. Let me take a look at this thing. As I was reading through it, it would talk about one. It said, all we, like sheep, have all gone astray. Each one has turned to his own way. But Hashem has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It said there that he would be killed, cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of my people. What a strange thing for our scriptures to say. And I got to the last verse in that section, and even though he'd been cut off, it said there that he would give the gifts, the spoils, to the stronger faith, because he had been cut off for my people, for my sins. How could he? I thought he had died. Now he's giving. It came to me that he hadn't. Maybe he came back to life. At that point, it became very clear what this section of scripture was speaking about. It seemed to be talking about you know who, that Jesus. Nothing is supposed to be this clear. These are really tricky, sneaky people. They put part of their Bible in what's supposed to be my Bible. What a bunch of idiots, thinking they're going to be able to trick real Jews, you know? And so when they said, so who do you think it's speaking about? I looked at them and I said, I don't know. I don't think anyone can tell. The Bible is such a mystery. No one can ever figure this out. They looked so disappointed. And they said to me, well, we'll be praying for you. I said, fat chance. What kind of God is there that'll want to answer prayers for someone like me? Where was this God in the Holocaust? I said to them.
Not
Over
that
that
old
period of time,
chestnut.
I found myself thinking more and more about it. My goodness, this might be our Messiah. I didn't like that. I remember, okay, God, if you have a Messiah for us, that's fine. But please, someone besides this Jesus. I was living in a very bad place when people were doing drugs. But some thoughts entered my mind. It seemed somehow clear to my thinking that drugs were opening me up to the spirit, but it was the wrong spirit. That there was a spiritual battle for my soul, but I was on the losing side. I wasn't sure. I got on my knees there and I cried out for Jesus to save me. I woke up that next morning. Somehow, I knew my life was different. I wasn't sure about all the details, but some things, and in my heart, I actually believed that Jesus is Lord, is our Messiah. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't sure where to go. Who do you talk to about these things? Not in that world. Well, there was a restaurant. There were pictures of Jesus on the wall. I really didn't know what would make someone a believer or something, so I thought that was a pretty good shot. So I went in there. It was really early in the morning. I didn't know what to do. They're just opening up the place, the manager opening up. And I said to him, hey, listen, Jesus saved me last night. What do I do now? The guy looked at me and said, I don't know. You want breakfast? Then I remembered that a long time before, I had gone to this, couldn't remember what they called it, a Bible thing, but maybe they would know what to do. I couldn't believe that they would remember me. But nonetheless, I called them up. I said, listen, my name is Sam Nadler. I came to your Bible thing a long time ago. But listen, Jesus saved me last night. What do I do now? They were so happy. They had been praying for me every day. Today, when people ask me, how can you believe in God in light of the Holocaust? In all of our afflictions, he was afflicted. And so to be his people means to be kind of his raw nerve endings. In all of these matters, he is afflicted. He mourns and cries over all of our pains and issues, let alone something like the Holocaust. But he, may his name be blessed forever. Our Messiah, he loved the unlovable. He forgave the unforgivable. But yet he died a horrible, evil, torturous death by crucifixion. He understands the pain of the Holocaust. He knows what it's like to go through your personal Holocaust. This is what he brings to our hearts as well.
Wow. Okay, last one, guys.
Growing up Jewish, I thought that Jesus was the God of the Catholic Church. He was just some guy kind of foreign to us, God of this other religion, but nothing to do with us as Jews.
When I was in high school, I earned the nicknames Drug Bear and Iron Man. Yeah, I mean, I smoked pot, I smoked hash, I used ups, I used downs, I used LSD, I used mescaline, I used amphetamines, I used cocaine, I shot heroin. I would take massive quantities just to see how far I could go. I once did enough mescaline, hallucinogenic drug, for 30 people, the equivalent of 1 ounce. I couldn't distinguish between reality and hallucination. I would walk with my hand in front of my face at night because I didn't know if the tree that was growing up in front of me was really there, or if the tree that grew up into fireworks, that they were really taking place. I'd see like a car coming at me, and suddenly the car became a person. You know, the eyes, the lights became eyes and a mouth. I'd see someone walking their dog, and that they morph into, they each become a little bit of each other. It was really going on a trip. I had a really wicked heart. I mean, I was proud, really proud, obnoxiously proud. And I was vicious with my tongue. I wasn't a fist fighter. I didn't get in fights, but I would cut people down. I would rip into them until they were in tears. I thought, well, if there really is a God, he knows I have a good heart. You know, if I see an old woman and she's entering a store, I'll open the door for her. Or if I'm in New York City and I see some poor bum, some drunkard on the street, I'll give him a few cents. So in my heart, I'm actually a good person. I thought a church, I don't know, kind of like synagogue. You say these prayers out of a book, and then maybe you have these other rituals that you go through or something like that. I don't know. And you got some guy hanging on a cross, and you know, that's what it's like. Well, not this church. This was very, very different. And then my friends would come back with stories. They said, the pastor was preaching from the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible that tells us about the end times. We're sitting around getting high, smoking pot, and they're telling me these stories. And they said, there's going to be a beast. It comes out of a bottomless pit, 7 heads, 10 horns. It's going to like rule the world. And I said, that's in the Bible? That's what they talk about in this church? That's a cool church. And at the end of the service, the pastor said, is there anyone here who wants to receive Jesus or ask Jesus into their hearts? I guess he did that in all the services. And my friend sitting next to me nudges me. He said, Mike, you should go up now. And see, I knew after my first visit there, these people are praying for me because they think like I'm the worst sinner in the world. These old people were really getting a kick out of it. If I go up there and say this prayer, they'll be all excited, like, oh, the big sinner went up. So I went up to pray the prayer. I didn't mean anything by it. I was having a little fun with it. So the pastor said, say these words out loud with me. I believe Jesus died for me. Okay. Jesus died for me. Jesus took my place. I sinned. I did all these bad things. He was perfect. He died for me. You know, I believe that's true. I believe Jesus did die for me. Say these words. I believe he rose from the dead. And I thought, you know, somehow, I know that's true also. The story didn't end just with him dying, but it goes on. That's why all these people believe in him today. He rose from the dead. I believe it. And then he said, and I promise to live for you all the days of my life. And I said the words. He said, did you mean that? I said, yes. He said, I believe you. God knew I didn't mean the last part. And that's when the deep spiritual battle really began to take place. I loved heavy rock music. So Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, and bands a little different, Jethro Tull, these different ones. Because I was a drummer, bass set, and pounded everything. It was kind of a whole new world for me. I thought, I want to play drums just like that. One of my favorite things to do in life was to get high and to go to a rock concert. And you talk about an experience. You go to a concert, say at the Fillmore East, and they have what's called the Joshua Light Show, this pounding, flashing light going on behind them. And here's Zeppelin, dazed and confused, and Robert Plant kind of staggering over the stage as he's singing, and Jimmy Page ripping out guitars, and John Bonham, that drummer with the heavy drum beat and bass player just driving this thing. And the music would be so loud, I would test it. I would scream at the top of my lungs. And if I could hear myself, the music wasn't loud enough. I lived for it. And then my own band, we'd play every day. We'd practice and play for hours and the loud music and getting high, man. We loved it. Now, I'm in this little church. There's maybe 40, 50 people there. I'm 16, long-haired hippie. You got guys 50, 60 years old in jackets and ties and ladies in their dresses. And there's the pastor's wife playing the piano. That's the instrument, piano. No amps, no boom sound. She's playing piano, and she's playing these little ditty hymns. There's within my heart a melody. Jesus whispers sweet and low. I'm talking about these silly little ditties. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling. Sunshine, sunshine in my soul today. I mean, that's what we're singing. And as we're singing these songs, and we're just singing a couple of songs, you get 40, 50 people, you got no amplification, no drugs. Suddenly, I experienced this joy I've never experienced in my life. I mean, I can't even describe it with words as I talk about it now. And immediately, it's like my life passed before me. I thought, getting high on drugs, no, this is different. Rock music, playing, going to a concert, this is different. Winning in sports, playing sport, no, this is different. Having a great relationship with someone, doing good for someone. I thought, this is different. This is completely different. This must be what these people call the joy of the Lord. And I realized this is how much God loves me. This is what Jesus did for me, dying on the cross. This was the most pure, amazing joy a human being can ever experience. When God made himself so real to me, at that point, I didn't want to live the way I was living. I said, I'll never put a needle in my arm again. When I experienced that incredible joy, and I realized how much God loved me. When I stopped doing drugs and I said, Dad, I got saved. I mean, who knew what the words meant? And he said, hallelujah. He was just making fun of it. He didn't take it seriously. Now, hang on. We're Jews. We don't believe this. See, he was Jewish enough to be concerned that his son is going to depart from the faith. I'm thrilled you're off drugs, but now you need to come back to Judaism. You need to talk to the local rabbi. And for me, I was excited to do it because I wanted my Jewish people to know about Jesus. I meet this rabbi and that one, ultra-Orthodox rabbis who've been studying these things for decades and centuries. And I thought, I need to learn more. My faith is secure in my heart. I need to learn more. I need to learn Hebrew. I need to learn more about Judaism. And the more I studied, the more clear it was that I was completely on the side of truth and following Jesus. We would keep having these discussions and debates, and so very, very few rabbis, despite their sincerity and all their study, have even opened up an honest question before God as to who he is. In their mind, it's blasphemous, it's sacrilegious. To read the New Testament is sacrilegious, so they stay away from it entirely. They don't know who he really is. They know some of the bad stories we preserve in our own traditions, hanging on a crucifix in a Catholic church, the horror stories of the Inquisitions and the Crusades and the terrible things that so-called Christians did to Jewish people through the years. What really happened was he was laying down his life for us. He was taking the place of the animal sacrifices. In other words, he was doing this as Yeshua, the promised Messiah, in keeping with scripture and our tradition. So he was not some Gentile God hanging on a cross from another religion. He was our Messiah, dying as the righteous one, taking our sins on his shoulders and then rising from the dead so that we can have a great relationship with God. And my dad, he actually would come and hear me preach. He wanted me to go back to Judaism, but then he saw how radically my life was changed and began to consider, could it be that Jesus is the Messiah? I remember he was even reading the New Testament, so his heart was wide open because he saw how Jesus had changed my life, and he knew that this was something only God could have done.
Wow. Okay, guys, God bless. Thanks for joining. See you tomorrow. I got a good stream for tomorrow, guys.